Okay, everyone. You know that feeling, don't you? That moment when, like, whatever you're working towards, that big career goal, that personal project that, once got you so fired up.
Yeah.
Even just getting through a day that feels like wading through mud suddenly just seems impossible. And that voice in your head starts whispering about just stopping.
Oh, yeah.
We've all been there.
Absolutely. We all have. And, that's exactly what we're going to be digging into today.
Okay.
So forget those like rah-rah pep talks.
Yeah.
We're not about that.
Oh.
We've actually gone through all the material you showed.
Yeah.
Let's just call it your pasted text for now.
Perfect.
To really understand what's actually going on. When they get up and go, just gets up and goes.
It really does.
More importantly, we want to give you some real solid strategies, like a real toolkit to find that spark again.
Exactly. Because motivation, it's not a bonfire, is it?
Yeah.
It's not just this endless burning fire.
It flickers.
It flickers. Yeah, sometimes it's blazing. Other times it's just embers. So in this deep dive, our goal is to give you those insights to fan those embers back into a flame.
That's right.
And we're going to do that when you need it most?
Yes.
So why does this happen?
Well, so I think we need to unpack why that initial burst of energy that we get often fades.
Okay.
And your sources actually touch on this.
Yeah.
When we begin something new, there's this rush of dopamine in the brain.
Yeah.
Right? And this is this neurochemical that makes us feel good, excited, optimistic.
Right.
Think about that buzz that you get at the very start of like a new project.
Yeah, that initial thrill.
Right.
But that doesn't last, does it?
Well, like any really intense feeling that dopamine surge isn't sustainable over the long term.
It's not.
As soon as that novelty kind of wears off, as soon as we hit like a snag a challenge, that chemical high dips. And what felt exciting now feels like effort.
Yeah, like a drag.
Yeah, just a bit of a drag.
Yeah.
And then, think about the impact of setbacks as well.
Okay.
Like a rejection, a failure, just the sense that you're not making any headway. One of your sources actually brought up this concept of learned helplessness.
Okay.
Which is essentially if we experience these repeated failures, we start to think, well, actually, our efforts don't matter.
Right.
So why bother trying?
Yeah, it can feel pointless, can't it?
It can feel pointless, and it's a very powerful demotivator.
It really is. And then you've got the everyday stuff as well, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
You've got deadlines, you've got money worries.
Absolutely.
You might even have people in your life who are not exactly supporting you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, shall we say they're not fueling our fire?
Yeah. Yeah, and all of that can really amplify that urge to just quit.
Absolutely. I mean, time constraints, financial strain, not having a support system.
Yeah.
These are big drains on our motivation.
They really are.
It's amazing what people manage to do, even with all of that stuff going on.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, and this is really key from your materials. Motivation isn't just some random emotion that shows up or doesn't.
Okay.
It's more like a muscle. It's a skill that can be developed and strengthened by understanding what drains it and what fuels it.
Okay, so we're clearer now on why we feel demotivated, but how do we put the brakes on?
Yeah.
How do we climb back up that hill?
Yeah.
So the first tool that I'm seeing here in your motivation toolkit is to re-examine your why.
Pre-examine and reframe.
Okay.
Because this is really your anchor, your foundation. The reason that you started doing this in the first place.
Okay.
And when those inevitable tough times hit, this is what keeps you connected to your goal.
But it's not enough just to have a why, is it?
No. It's not enough just to have this vague idea.
You've got to really
You need to revisit it.
revisit it, yeah, and be specific about it.
Exactly. And your materials really stress the power of getting very specific.
Yeah.
They even gave a great example, actually,
Go on.
of shifting from, I want to lose weight,
Yeah.
which is quite a general thing,
It is very general.
to I want to lose weight so I can play with my kids in the park without getting winded.
Oh, wow.
So it's connecting it
Yeah.
to something really specific.
It makes it more compelling, doesn't it?
It makes it tangible. It makes it emotionally significant.
Right.
It connects the present struggle with the outcome.
Yeah.
And research shows that having a clear purpose
Yeah.
leads to greater resilience.
Okay, so the actionable step here is to sit down, think about your why,
Yes.
write it down in detail,
Yeah.
and then make it visible.
Make it visible. Put it somewhere where you'll see it all the time.
Oh, okay.
On your bathroom mirror as your screensaver,
Yeah.
on your phone, whatever works for you.
Yeah.
And it's not static.
Right.
As you grow and your goals change, your why can evolve as well.
Yeah.
The key is to maintain that connection with it.
Okay, so we've got our why. We know why we're doing it.
Yes.
How do we break it down, though? Because sometimes it just feels too big.
Right. Well, This is the second key strategy from your sources. Break down these big, daunting goals into small, manageable steps, otherwise known as micro goals.
Okay.
Because feeling overwhelmed can be a real motivation killer.
Yeah.
You just think it's so far off, I don't even know where to begin.
I don't know where to start.
And it leads to this kind of paralysis.
I know that feeling so well.
I bet you do.
Yeah. It's like staring at a blank page when you've got to write a novel.
Yes, exactly.
Or a blank canvas when you've got to paint a masterpiece.
Exactly.
Where do you even start?
Well, the solution is to take that big objective and break it down into these tiny, actionable pieces.
Okay.
So instead of write a book,
Yeah.
the micro goal would be write 200 words today.
Okay. Yeah.
Instead of run a marathon,
Yeah.
the micro goal is run 1 mile without stopping.
I can do that.
Exactly. And they're tangible. They're
Oh.
achievable in the short term.
And you get those small wins, don't you?
Yes, you do. You get these small wins.
And each time you accomplish one, it gives you that little boost of dopamine.
Yes, exactly. They're like positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
And your sources talk about acknowledging and celebrating those wins.
Okay.
You know, you finish those 200 words,
Yeah.
take a break, have a reward. Your brain responds to that.
And they all add up, don't they?
They do. They
Yeah.
really do. And that cumulative effect of all these small steps is really significant.
Okay. So we've got our why we're breaking things down. What's next?
Well, I think the next thing is embracing the power of routine.
Okay.
Because let's be honest, relying solely on feeling motivated
Yeah.
is about as dependable as the weather forecast.
You're not wrong there.
Your mood,
Yeah.
your energy levels, they fluctuate.
Yeah.
If you only act when you feel motivated, you're going to be stopping and starting all the time.
So we need to establish habits.
We need to establish consistent habits.
Okay.
They provide the structure that doesn't depend on your feelings.
So what do we pick one thing?
Pick one consistent action that supports your goal
Okay.
and commit to doing it regularly.
Okay. So for example, what could we do?
Well, you could dedicate 5 minutes each morning to language practice, or you could spend 10 minutes stretching before bed.
Okay. So small things, but regularly.
Exactly. Consistency, even in small doses, trumps sporadic intensity.
Okay.
James Clear talks about this in Atomic Habits,
Yeah.
which your sources referenced.
Yeah.
These habits, they compound over time and lead to remarkable progress.
So 5 minutes every day might not feel like much,
No.
but over a year, it could lead to something big.
Yeah, exactly. And the sources also talk about habit stacking,
Okay.
which is essentially linking the new habit
Okay.
to an existing habit.
Right.
So for example,
Yeah.
right after I brush my teeth in the morning, I will do my language practice.
Right.
So it piggybacks on something you already do.
Right.
So your brain doesn't even have to think about it.
Yeah.
It just becomes the next step.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
So even when your motivation dips,
Yeah.
your routine will carry you forward.
Okay. So we've talked about we've talked about breaking things down. We've talked about habits, but sometimes that urge to quit isn't about lack of drive. It's about fear of failure.
It is.
It's like we're trying to protect ourselves
Yes, absolutely.
from being disappointed.
Yeah, the anxiety of putting in all that effort
Yeah.
and then not achieving what you want
Yeah.
can be very powerful.
It can.
That little voice in your head is saying,
Yeah.
what if you try your hardest and you still fail?
Yeah. What if I'm just not good enough?
Exactly.
And then you just don't even start.
Yeah, it's a way of avoiding confronting that failure.
But the thing is, and your sources really highlight, this failure is part of success.
It is.
It's not the opposite.
Right.
It's like a stepping stone.
It is.
Think about all the people who have achieved great things.
Exactly.
They've all failed.
They've all had setbacks along the way.
Yeah. J.K. Rowling, she got tons of rejections
Yeah.
before Harry Potter was published.
And Thomas Edison had loads of failed light bulbs.
So many light bulbs.
Yeah, exactly.
So failure is actually feedback.
Yes.
It's a way to learn.
It is.
Not a judgment on you.
Exactly. Your sources encourage us to reframe these setbacks as data points.
Okay.
So you didn't meet a sales target.
Yeah.
Analyze why a presentation didn't resonate.
Yeah.
Get some constructive criticism.
Right.
When you view failure as a teacher,
Yeah.
it takes away its power.
It does. And also, what's the regret gonna be?
Yeah.
If I quit now because I'm scared of failing,
Yeah.
I might regret that later.
Right.
What if I had just kept going?
Exactly.
So sometimes that fear of not even trying is bigger than the fear of failure.
Absolutely. And that leads us to this fifth strategy,
Right.
which is the importance of who you surround yourself with.
Oh yeah, your people.
Yeah, your people, we're social beings, we're influenced by our environment and the
Right.
people we spend time with.
if you're around people who are negative or discouraging,
Yeah.
it's really hard to stay positive.
It is.
But if you're around enthusiastic and supportive people,
Yes.
it can really lift you up.
It can, and this isn't just anecdotal.
Right.
Your sources actually reference the Framingham Heart Study,
Okay.
which remarkably demonstrated that things like happiness and even motivation can spread through social networks.
Oh, wow.
So it's like contagious positive energy.
So we need to really think about who we're spending time with.
Yeah. Take stock of your social circle.
Yeah.
Who encourages you,
Yeah.
who celebrates your progress,
Yeah.
and who is critical or discouraging.
Yeah.
And you don't have to cut people off,
Right.
but prioritize your time with
Yeah.
the good people.
Okay. And what about finding people who are working towards similar goals?
Yes. Find your tribe,
Yeah.
online forums, local clubs, workshops.
Yeah.
Connect with people who have similar aspirations.
It's really good to not feel alone, isn't it?
Yeah, you get that camaraderie. You
Yeah.
can share your experiences and learn from each other.
Yeah.
You're less likely to feel isolated.
Okay, so that's the people we surround ourselves with. What about the voice in our head?
Ah, yes, the inner critic.
Yeah, because often that's the biggest barrier, isn't
Let's
it?
see, can be.
It's not even external, it's internal.
Yes, that internal voice can be very powerful.
Yeah.
And it can be a source of so much negativity.
Yeah, and especially when you're already feeling demotivated.
Yes.
It's like it just gets louder and it makes you
bummer.
doubt yourself.
Yeah.
It criticizes you and
Yeah.
it just tells you to quit.
It says give up.
So how do we quiet that voice?
Well, the first step is to become aware of it.
Okay.
Notice that you're doing it.
Okay.
And your sources say don't try and suppress it
Right.
because that can backfire.
It can.
But notice the thoughts without judging them.
Okay.
Just observe them.
Right.
Like clouds passing in the sky.
Okay.
Then you need to challenge them.
Right.
If it says you're going to fail,
Yeah.
counter it with something more positive.
Like I've got this.
Yeah, I've done this before.
I can learn from my mistakes.
I can improve.
Okay, so I'm consciously reframing it.
Yes, and your sources also talk about third-person self-talk,
Okay.
which is really interesting.
What's that?
Well, instead of saying to yourself, I can do this,
Yeah.
try saying, you've got this.
Oh, right. You've got this.
Yeah. Research by psychologist Ethan Kross
Okay.
suggests that this creates a psychological distance
Okay.
which reduces stress
Okay.
and actually boosts your resolve.
So it's like you're giving yourself advice.
Exactly. It's like getting advice from yourself,
Right.
but from a more objective place.
Okay, I like that.
Okay, so we've talked about reframing our thoughts.
Yeah.
And that leads us quite nicely onto this next strategy from your sources,
Okay.
which is rest, don't quit.
Rest, don't quit.
Because sometimes that urge to give up
Yeah.
is actually your body and mind
Yeah.
telling you they need a break.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah, you're exhausted.
Yeah.
You need to rest.
But that's not a weakness, is it?
It's not, it's essential.
Okay.
Rest is a strategic necessity.
Okay, I like that.
If you push yourself relentlessly when you're burnt out,
Yeah.
you're going to be counterproductive.
Okay, so what do we do? Schedule breaks?
Yeah, schedule breaks even before you feel completely depleted.
Right.
Use techniques like the Pomodoro technique,
Yeah.
working in intervals with
Yeah.
regular breaks.
Uh-huh.
Even just stepping away for a few minutes to
Yeah.
move around, clear your head,
Okay.
can make a big difference.
And if I'm properly burnt out.
If you're in a deeper state of exhaustion,
Yeah.
take a longer break,
Okay.
a day off a weekend
Right.
to disconnect and recharge.
Oh.
And you'll find when you return,
Yeah.
you'll have a fresh perspective.
Okay, so now that we're feeling refreshed,
Mm-hmm.
your sources talk about the power of visualization.
Yes.
And not just the finish line,
No.
but the journey.
The journey as well.
So this is more than just wishful thinking then.
It's more than just wishful thinking.
Okay.
There's a real psychological impact. Visualization helps to make your goals feel more tangible,
Yeah.
more attainable.
Okay.
Research in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology shows that vividly imagining a successful outcome
Yeah.
enhances your motivation
Okay.
and your belief in your ability to achieve it.
So picture yourself having achieved the goal.
Yes,
How does that feel?
exactly.
Okay, but also picture the steps along the way.
Yes. Visualize the process.
Okay.
Mentally rehearse taking those steps,
Okay.
overcoming obstacles,
Yeah.
getting those small wins.
So it makes it feel less abstract and
Mhm.
more real.
It makes it feel more within your control.
Okay, so we've got the visualization.
Mm-hmm.
What about actually tracking our progress?
Yes, that's a really good one.
It's practical, isn't it?
It is very practical.
But sometimes it's easy to forget to do it.
It is.
And it's really easy to feel like you're not getting anywhere
Yeah, if you don't have a way to measure it.
if you don't see it.
Yeah,
So track your progress.
track your progress.
however you want to do it.
Yeah, whether it's through a journal, a spreadsheet, a visual chart,
Yeah.
whatever works for you.
It's really good to have that visual, isn't it?
It is, because it provides concrete evidence of your efforts
Yeah.
and your achievements,
Yeah.
no matter how small.
Even the tiny things.
Yes, because seeing those numbers increase, seeing that to-do list shrink,
Yeah,
can give you a real boost.
it can.
It's a tangible reminder that you are moving forward.
And it also keeps you accountable, doesn't it?
It does, because you can see what's working
Yeah.
and what's not.
And it's harder to quit when you can see how far you've come.
It is.
Okay, so final strategy.
Yes.
Accepting that it's okay to pivot.
Yes.
Because sometimes that urge to quit
Yeah,
means that the goal is no longer right for us.
exactly.
Maybe things have changed,
Life changes.
or our priorities have changed.
Your values, your desires, they evolve.
Yeah, and if we're holding on to a goal that's no longer right for us, it can be really demotivating.
It can be.
So sometimes we need to let go.
Sometimes we need to change direction.
And that's not failure, is it?
It's not, it's self-awareness.
Yeah.
It's courage.
Yeah.
It's strength.
It's growth.
Yeah.
So it's not giving up.
No.
Is having the wisdom to know when something's not right anymore.
Yes.
And the courage to redirect our energy.
Exactly.
So if you're in a job that is making you unhappy,
Yeah,
it's okay to leave.
it is.
Or if you've had a passion for something for years, but it's not there anymore,
Yeah.
it's okay to move on.
Yes, these are acts of self-respect.
And we deserve to be fulfilled, don't we?
We do.
So there we have it, the complete motivation toolkit.
Yes.
We talked about reconnecting with your,
Yeah.
breaking down goals,
Yeah.
building routines, reframing failure,
Yes.
surrounding yourself with the right people,
Yes.
mastering your inner dialogue,
Yes.
using rest visualization,
Yes.
tracking your progress, and pivoting when you need to. And the key message here is that motivation, it's not something you're born with or without.
No.
It's a set of strategies
Yeah.
that anyone can learn.
Yes.
So the next time you feel like giving up, remember, you don't have to use all of these at once.
Oh.
Just pick one.
Pick one that resonates with you in that moment.
And give it a go.
Yeah, and often just taking that first step forward
Yeah.
is enough.
To reignite that spark.
Exactly.
And motivation often follows action.
it does.
We don't have to wait to feel motivated to start.
You don't.
We just need to start
And you will start to feel more motivated.
and think about the benefits of pushing through. You build resilience.
Yeah.
You cultivate grit.
Yes.
And you develop confidence.
confidence in your ability to achieve your goals.
So think about people who you really admire, who've achieved great things. Their journey wasn't always easy, was it?
No, it probably wasn't.
They had setbacks. They had doubts.
Yeah.
But they kept going.
They persevere.
And you can too.
Yes, you can.
The only difference between you and them is
Well.
time and persistence.
That's all. So keep going. Keep fanning those flames.
You've got this.
You've absolutely got this.
Yes.
All right, so you know that feeling, right? When a name is just right there on the tip of your tongue.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Totally. And we got some really cool articles from you guys about why that happens, why our memories, well, why they sometimes completely fail us.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Totally. And so today, we're taking a deep dive into that very question. Is forgetting, is it like a glitch in our brains?
Yeah.
Or is it, and this is going to sound weird, is it actually like a feature?
A feature?
Yeah. The stuff you sent makes a pretty strong case that it might actually be a good thing sometimes.
Right. And the fact that we all experience forgetting, you know, it's
Yeah.
like this universal human thing. That's what makes it so interesting to figure out how it works and how come it doesn't always work.
Exactly. So based on what you sent over, here's the plan for today's deep dive. We'll start with memory basics. How does this thing even work?
The nuts and bolts.
Then we'll dig into why we forget things, from those little everyday slips to the bigger memory lapses that were talked about in one of those studies you sent. And then, get this, we'll even explore how forgetting might actually be a good thing, like some of the articles hinted at.
Interesting.
And of course, we'll try to give you some practical tips and tricks so you can maybe, just maybe, remember where you left your keys a little more often.
Always helpful.
Right. We're basically taking a deep dive into how your brain works, directly from the stuff you guys sent in. So how do we even make memories in the first place? Let's start there.
Great, let's do it.
So the first step is called encoding. It's basically your brain taking in everything around you, the sights, the sounds, the smells.
All that sensory stuff.
And it converts it all into like a brain-friendly language that it can store. It's kind of like typing words into a computer. You got to put it in the right format, right?
Right.
I remember you highlighted that attention plays a big role in one of the articles.
Absolutely. And coding isn't just something that passively happens to you. The more you focus, the more effort you put into processing what's going on around you, the stronger that memory is going to be right from the start. Think about it this way. You're having two conversations, right? One you're barely paying attention to, and one where you're hanging on every word. Which one are you going to remember better?
The one I'm actually paying attention to.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So you've got to be in the moment to even capture that information in the first place. Okay, so you've encoded the information right. What next? Where does it go?
Storage.
Right, storage.
That's where that encoded information gets held onto for you. And different parts of your brain are involved, like short-term memory, sometimes called working memory. It's your brain's temporary scratch pad, like when you look up a phone number real quick.
That scratch pad gets erased pretty quickly
for most of us.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's long-term memory. That's where stuff gets stored for, well, potentially your whole life.
Wow, a whole life.
And a few key players are involved here. Like the hippocampus, which is like the memory maker. It's super important for forming those new long-term memories. One of the articles really emphasized that.
Oh, yeah.
And the amygdala, which handles your emotions. That's why some memories feel so powerful. They're tied to emotion.
Yes, yeah.
Those vivid emotional moments that you easily recall. That's the amygdala at work, helping to make those memories strong for you.
Okay.
And then we've got the cerebral cortex. It's like the filing cabinet for tons of those long-term memories.
Okay, so we encode, it bounces around for a bit, and then hopefully it settles into long-term storage.
Yeah.
But even if it makes it there, that doesn't mean I can always get it back.
Yeah.
Which brings us to retrieval, the last piece of the memory puzzle.
Exactly. Retrieval is you going back into those mental files and finding what you need, but it's not always as easy as it sounds, right? No, it's like searching for a file on your computer. If it wasn't saved properly to begin with, maybe you didn't encode or store it well, or if you don't use the right keywords to search for it, you're never going to find it. How well you can pull up a memory totally depends on how well you encoded and stored it in the first place. But sometimes, even memories that you did encode and store well, they just get lost for a while.
Which is exactly what we're trying to figure out. Why does that happen? Why do these memories that we know are somewhere in our brains just vanish? Okay, let's dig into the main culprits behind forgetting, and we'll use the theories from the stuff you sent. First up, decay theory.
Okay, so decay theory is actually pretty simple. It basically says that memories, especially the ones in short-term memory, they just fade away over time if you don't use them.
Like if I don't use it, I lose it.
Pretty much. Like imagine a path through the woods. If nobody walks on it for years, it gets overgrown and disappears. It's the same with memories. If you don't use the neural pathways associated with a memory, they can weaken and eventually disappear.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about when I forget stuff that I think about a lot?
That's where interference comes in.
Right, interference.
That's when memories get all jumbled up and it's hard to pick out the one you need. That research paper you sent, it went into that pretty deep, didn't it?
It did.
So interference is basically when similar memories compete with each other. And there are two main types. Proactive interference is when older memories make it hard to learn new stuff.
Oh, like trying to remember a new password when my old one keeps popping up. I know the new one, but my brain just keeps going back to the old one.
Exactly. That's proactive interference for you. The old memory, the old password, is blocking the new one. And then there's retroactive interference, which is the flip side. That's when learning new stuff makes it hard to remember older things.
So if I spend weeks learning like a new computer program, I might forget how to use the old one that I used for years. It's like the new information overwrites the old stuff, and one of the articles talked about that.
Yep, you nailed it. That's retroactive interference. It's like your new learning is reaching back and messing with your older memories. So basically, the more you learn, the trickier it can be to recall older stuff. It's a reminder that what you know is always changing.
It's like my brain has a limited number of slots. When new stuff comes in, the old stuff gets pushed out.
A good analogy.
All right, so we've got decay and interference. What's next? Retrieval failure. Is that when the memory's there, but I just can't quite grasp it.
That's a great way to put it. Retrieval failure is when a memory exists in your brain somewhere, but you're missing the right cues to access it. Like, you know that tip of the tongue feeling?
Oh, the worst. I can almost feel the memory, but it's just out of reach.
Exactly. You know it, but you can't quite spit it out.
Yeah.
And what often happens is if someone gives you a little hint, maybe the first letter of the word or some detail about the event, boom, the memory comes flooding back, which proves that the memory was there all along. You just needed the right trigger.
Huh. That's pretty cool. Okay, now this next one seems a bit more psychological. Motivated forgetting.
Motivated forgetting.
It's the idea that we might, bury unpleasant memories on purpose.
Right. One of those psychology texts you sent talked about that.
It did?
And it suggests that sometimes you forget things because, well, you want to. It can be a conscious decision, like when you intentionally try to block something out. But it can also be subconscious, like your emotions playing a big role in what you remember and what you forget.
Huh. Interesting.
It is.
Okay, what about memory distortion? This is the idea that memories aren't like perfect recordings. They can actually change over time.
Right. It makes you think, huh?
Yeah, it kind of freaks me out. Does that mean I can remember things that never even happened?
It's possible. And it just goes to show that memory isn't always reliable. Your memories, you're actually rebuilding them every time you remember them. And during that process, your current beliefs, your feelings, even stuff other people say, it can all influence those memories.
Whoa, that's wild, like eyewitness testimony.
Exactly. The eyewitness testimony used to be like the gold standard.
Right.
But now we know it can be really unreliable. You know, leading questions, talking to other witnesses. It can change how someone remembers an event. It's something to keep in mind, for sure.
Definitely. So my memories are more like stories that I keep retelling, and those stories can change over time. Okay, last one. Brain damage and neurological conditions.
Right.
This one seems more straightforward. You know, there's damage, and so you forget.
Yes. With brain damage and neurological conditions, forgetting isn't because of those normal memory processes we've been talking about.
Right.
It's because there's been actual physical damage to the brain, or there's a disorder that affects how the brain handles memories. Think Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, even head injuries. They can all really hurt your memory.
Wow.
And as people naturally age, their memory can decline too. Your sources brought that up a few times as well.
Yeah, they did. It's a reminder that memory is tied to our physical brains. Okay, so we've covered a bunch of reasons why we forget, from memories just fading away to interference to actual brain damage. Forgetting is a huge part of how our brains work. But you said earlier that forgetting might actually be a good thing. I gotta know more about that. How can forgetting be good?
Well, think about it. Your brain is constantly bombarded with information. Imagine if you remembered every single thing.
Oh, gosh.
Every detail, every sensation. You'd be totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Forgetting acts like a filter, helping you get rid of unnecessary information. It's not just deleting stuff, it's about prioritizing.
Yeah.
Making sure your brain focuses on what's important right now.
So my brain declutters for me, like getting rid of junk mail so I can see the important stuff.
Exactly. By forgetting the little things, you free up space to remember the things that matter. It makes your brain more efficient and helps you make better decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. If I remembered every conversation I've ever had, I wouldn't get anything done.
Right.
Too much information.
Exactly. And it's not just about being efficient. Forgetting can also be good for your emotional well-being.
Okay.
Forgetting painful experiences, even though it's not always easy, it helps you move on. It builds your resilience.
So forgetting isn't just about thinking, it's about surviving. Letting go of the past so I can live in the present. It's a really interesting way to think about it. Okay, so forgetting is normal. It can even be helpful. But what about when I want to remember things better? Are there any tricks to improve my memory and stop forgetting so much?
There are some things you can do, and a lot of them go back to how memory works.
Okay.
Like one of the most basic is repetition. Like we were talking about with decay theory. The more you recall a memory, the stronger it gets. Spaced repetition is a great technique. It's basically revisiting information at longer and longer intervals.
Yeah, I've heard that's a good one.
The studies you shared, they backed that up. It's really good for long-term memory.
Interesting. Okay, what else? Mnemonics and memory aids.
Those can be really helpful.
I always thought those were kind of gimmicky.
They might seem like tricks, but they work because they make information easier to remember or recall. They're like shortcuts for your brain. Think of acronyms like ROYGBV for the colors of the rainbow.
Oh yeah, ROYGBV.
Or rhymes, visualization, connecting new information to things you already know. It's all about giving your brain stronger cues so it can grab onto those memories.
Like that old saying, every good boy does fine for remembering musical notes.
Exactly. It's silly, but it works. Okay, now let's talk about your overall health.
Oh, health too.
Your sources mentioned this too, didn't they?
Yeah.
Taking care of your body is super important for your brain, including your memory.
Okay.
Exercise gets more blood flowing to your brain. Eating healthy gives your brain the nutrients it needs. And sleep. Sleep is so important for consolidating memories. It's like when you sleep, your brain is working hard to make those new memories stick. A lot of your sources highlighted that.
So I'm making memories in my sleep.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And don't forget mental exercise. Puzzles, reading, anything that keeps your brain active helps.
So it's physical and mental exercise.
Makes sense. Now, what about when I'm actually trying to learn something new? Can I do anything to make that encoding process better?
Being mindful and focused when you're learning is huge. Get rid of distractions, really be in the moment. That way the information gets processed deeper and has a better chance of sticking.
It's tough these days with, phones and everything.
It is, but focusing is like a superpower for your memory.
I like that. And you mentioned emotional connection too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We tend to remember things better if they're tied to our emotions or if they mean something to us personally. So when you're learning, try to connect it to your own life, your interests, your goals. Make it meaningful, and it'll be more likely to stick with you.
It's true. I remember stuff way better if I can relate it to my own life somehow. Okay, last tip, retrieval practice. Is that kind of like repetition? It's similar, but instead of just passively reading or reviewing information, you actively try to recall it from memory. Like, test yourself. Even if it's just quizzing yourself in your head, it strengthens the connections in your brain and makes it easier to access that memory again later. It's a more active way to learn. Some of the studies you looked at showed amazing results with that.
So instead of reading my notes a million times, I should try to explain the concepts to myself or even someone else without looking.
Yeah.
Force myself to recall it.
Exactly. That active recall really makes a difference.
Okay, this has been a pretty incredible deep dive into memory and forgetting. I really appreciate the sources you sent. It's been super interesting. Let's recap what we've learned today.
Yes, let's.
So we've learned that forgetting isn't a failure. It's actually a normal and often very helpful part of how our brains work.
Right.
It keeps us from getting overloaded and helps us focus on what's important.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective too, which some of your readings touched on.
All right. You can't remember everything, but understanding how memory works, the encoding, storage, retrieval, that gives you the power to improve your memory.
Right.
Repetition, mnemonics, being healthy, paying attention, making learning meaningful, testing yourself. These are all things that can make a huge difference.
And at the end of the day, your memory, even with all its quirks, it's a big part of who you are. It shapes your identity. It helps you learn and grow from your experiences. You even wrote about that in your own notes.
Well, it did. It's true.
Which leads me to a final thought, and it gets a bit philosophical, but it's really interesting.
I'm listening.
We've talked about how memories aren't perfect. They can be distorted. So if that's true, what does that mean for who we are?
Ooh, I like that.
Right. What does that mean for our sense of self? What does it mean that our stories about our own lives are based on memories that might not be entirely accurate?
Big question.
It is. It is. Think about this, your most treasured memories. They're not perfect recordings. They're your brain's interpretation of what happened, as one of the articles said. It makes you wonder about the nature of memory and how much it shapes who you think you are. Something to ponder long after this deep dive is over.
Hello, and welcome to the Learn English Lab. I'm your host, Mike, and today we've got a really fascinating deep dive lined up.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one.
I am too. I'm excited to welcome Sarah to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Today we are talking about happiness and...
Ooh, happiness. Who doesn't love a good conversation about happiness?
I mean, it's something we all want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone wants to be happy.
But I think it's a lot more complicated than people think.
Oh, for sure. It's not just about smiling all the time or, winning the lottery or anything like that.
Yeah, like what actually is happiness?
Right. It's a big question.
So we're going to try to dig into some of that today. Unpack the science behind it a little bit,
Right.
Look at, the biological and the psychological factors that contribute to a fulfilling life.
I love that the science of happiness, because it really is a science.
It is. There's so much research out there.
There is, yeah.
So where do we even begin? I guess maybe a good starting point is defining what we mean by happiness, because it's not just one thing, is it?
No, definitely not. And actually, researchers often talk about two different types of happiness.
Okay.
So there's what they call hedonic happiness.
Hedonic happiness.
Yes, basically that kind of immediate pleasure or enjoyment that we get from things.
Okay.
So, think like a really delicious meal or a fun night out with friends.
Like that rush you get when your team scores.
Exactly. Or,
Yeah.
That first sip of coffee in the morning.
Yeah, okay, so those kind of short-term pleasure.
Exactly. And it's very much driven by those external things, those stimuli,
Okay.
But then there's this other type of happiness that's a bit deeper, and that's called eudaimonic happiness.
Eudaimonic happiness.
Yes, it's a mouthful.
It is.
But this type of happiness is more about meaning and purpose in life. It's about personal growth. It's about feeling like you're contributing to something bigger than yourself.
Okay, so it's less about those external things, those quick hits, and more about something internal.
Exactly. It's about feeling fulfilled.
So is it like the difference between, like a sugary snack that gives you a quick burst of energy versus like a nourishing meal that keeps you going all day?
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
I like that.
So both are good, right? But
Absolutely. Both have their place.
yeah.
But, if you're only ever having those sugary snacks, you're probably not going to feel that great in the long run.
Yeah, and I imagine the research backs that up, right? That the eudaimonic happiness is more associated with long-term well-being.
Exactly. Spot on. Research is showing increasingly that it's really this deeper sense of fulfillment that's linked to better mental and physical health, stronger relationships, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like having a strong foundation versus, just building your house on sand.
I like that analogy.
So we've talked about these two types of happiness, but let's dig into the nitty-gritty a little bit. You mentioned earlier that there's a biological component to happiness, like our bodies are actually involved in this.
Oh, absolutely. Our brains and bodies are incredible. They produce this whole array of chemicals, neurotransmitters, hormones that are constantly influencing our mood and how we experience happiness.
So it's like a chemistry experiment going on inside of us.
Kind of, yeah.
So let's talk about some of these chemicals, because I know there are a few key players. Everyone's heard of dopamine, right? The reward chemical.
Oh, yes. Dopamine is a big one. It plays a crucial role in our brain's reward system.
Okay, so how does that work?
So basically, whenever we achieve a goal or experience something pleasurable, our brain releases dopamine, and that gives us that feeling of satisfaction.
So like when you finally finish that project you've been working on.
Exactly. Or when you eat a piece of chocolate.
Or when you, hit a new personal best at the gym.
Yeah, anything that gives you that sense of reward.
Okay.
But what's really fascinating is that research suggests that the anticipation of a reward can sometimes be even more powerful than the reward itself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so like planning that vacation you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Your brain might be buzzing with dopamine even more during the planning stages than when you're actually on the trip.
So it's like the journey is as good as the destination.
Exactly.
I like that. Okay, so that's dopamine. What about serotonin?
Serotonin is another crucial neurotransmitter,
Okay.
and it's often called the mood stabilizer because it plays a big role in regulating our mood, sleep, appetite, even social behavior.
Okay, so if you're feeling down or anxious, could that be related to low serotonin levels?
Yeah, potentially low levels of serotonin have been linked to depression and anxiety.
I see.
But the good news is there are lots of natural ways to boost serotonin.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, things like regular exercise, spending time outdoors, getting enough sunlight,
That's good to know.
even simple things like connecting with loved ones and practicing gratitude can have a positive impact.
So it's not all about medication.
No, not at all, although medication can be helpful in certain cases.
Of course.
But yeah, lifestyle factors play a huge role.
Okay, and I think we've got one more chemical to talk about, oxytocin.
Ah, yes, the love hormone.
The love hormone. Tell us about that.
So oxytocin is released during moments of physical touch, social bonding acts of kindness.
Okay.
And it basically fosters this feeling of trust, connection, and belonging.
So like when you hug someone you care about.
Exactly. Or, when you do something nice for someone and you get that warm, fuzzy feeling inside,
Yeah.
that's oxytocin working its magic.
And that reinforces how important relationships are for our well-being.
Absolutely. Our connections with others are fundamental to our happiness.
Okay, so we've covered Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, any other key players in the happiness game?
Well, we can't forget about endorphins.
Endorphins, right? The runner's high.
Exactly. Endorphins are our body's natural painkillers and mood boosters.
So they're released when we exercise.
Yes, during physical exertion, but also in response to pain and even laughter.
So a good laugh can actually give you a mood boost.
Absolutely. Laughter is the best medicine, as they say.
And it's all thanks to endorphins.
Exactly.
So it sounds like our bodies are really working hard to keep us happy.
They are, in a way.
And it's amazing how many different factors are involved.
Yeah, it's a complex system, but that's what makes it so fascinating.
So we've covered the biological side of things, but what about the psychological side?
Yeah, so our minds are just as important as our bodies when it comes to happiness.
Okay, and are there like certain frameworks or models that psychologists use to understand happiness?
Absolutely. There are lots of different theories and models, but one that I find particularly helpful is the PERMA model.
PERMA.
Yeah, it's an acronym that stands for 5 key elements of well-being.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the P stands for positive emotions.
Okay, so experiencing joy, gratitude, hope, all those good feelings.
Exactly.
Okay, what about E?
E is for engagement.
Engagement.
Yeah, it's about being completely absorbed in an activity.
Oh, like when you're so focused on something, you lose track of time.
Exactly. That's often called flow, and it's a really powerful state to be in.
Yeah, I love those moments.
Me too.
Okay, so positive emotions engagement. What's R?
R is for relationships.
Of course.
Because as we talked about before, our connections with others are absolutely crucial for our well-being.
So nurturing those bonds, spending time with loved ones.
Exactly.
Okay, what about M?
M is for meaning.
Meaning, so having a sense of purpose in life.
Exactly. Feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself, whether that's through your work, your relationships, your hobbies, anything that gives you that sense of why.
I like that. And finally, A?
A is for accomplishment.
Accomplishment. So achieving goals, feeling competent.
Exactly. Those feelings of success and mastery contribute to our overall sense of fulfillment.
So PERMA, positive emotions, engagement relationships, meaning accomplishment.
Yes, those are the 5 pillars of well-being according to this model.
And I imagine all of them are important, right?
They are, but research suggests that meaning and engagement tend to be particularly strong predictors of overall life satisfaction.
Interesting. So it's not just about feeling good. It's about feeling like your life has purpose and that you're actively involved in it.
Exactly. It's about living a full and engaged life.
Now, I want to touch on another interesting concept, the hedonic treadmill. Have you heard of this?
Oh yes, the hedonic treadmill. It's a fascinating idea.
So what's the basic premise?
Well, the theory suggests that we humans have a tendency to adapt to both positive and negative events in our lives.
Okay.
So even after a major life change, whether it's good or bad, we tend to eventually return to a relatively stable level of happiness.
So it's like we're on this treadmill where we keep running and running, but we never really get anywhere.
Kind of, yeah. It's like our happiness set point resets.
So like if someone wins the lottery, they might be ecstatic at first.
Right.
But over time, that initial euphoria fades and they end up back at their baseline level of happiness.
Exactly. And the same goes for negative events. You know, after a difficult breakup or a job loss,
Yeah.
we might feel devastated at first,
Yeah.
but eventually the intensity of those feelings tends to lessen and we start to adapt.
So does that mean we're all just stuck at a certain level of happiness no matter what we do?
Well, it's not quite that deterministic. The speed and extent to which we adapt can vary from person to person.
Okay.
And while we might not be able to completely escape the hedonic treadmill, there are things we can do to slow it down, or at least make the ride a bit smoother.
Like what?
Well, practices like gratitude and mindfulness can help us appreciate what we have and savor positive experiences for longer.
Okay, so instead of always chasing the next big thing, we focus on the present moment.
Exactly, and focusing on intrinsic goals.
Yeah.
Those things that are inherently rewarding to us rather than external rewards like money or status can also lead to more lasting satisfaction.
So it's about finding joy in the process rather than just the outcome.
Exactly.
Now, I also want to talk about the happiness set point because I think this ties in with what we've been discussing.
Yes, the happiness set point is another important concept.
So what is it exactly?
Well, research suggests that our baseline level of happiness is partially determined by our genes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's estimated that genetics account for about 50% of our happiness set point.
So some people are just naturally predisposed to be happier than others.
It seems that way.
Okay, what about the other 50%?
Well, external circumstances like our health and relationships play a role. They contribute about 10%.
Okay, so our genes and our circumstances make up about 60% of our happiness level.
That's right. But here's the really empowering part. The remaining 40% is thought to be influenced by our intentional activities and the choices we make.
Wow, so almost half of our happiness is within our control.
Exactly.
That's actually really encouraging.
It is. It means that even if we have a genetic predisposition or are facing difficult circumstances, we still have a significant amount of agency in shaping our own well-being.
So let's talk about some of those intentional activities. What are some evidence-based strategies that people can use to boost their happiness?
Well, as we mentioned before, gratitude is a powerful tool, making a conscious effort to appreciate the good things in your life. Even the small things can have a big impact on your overall happiness.
So like keeping a gratitude journal or just taking a few moments each day to reflect on what you're grateful for.
Exactly. And another key strategy is to engage in activities that you find meaningful.
Okay.
Whether that's pursuing a hobby, volunteering for a cause you care about, or doing work that aligns with your values.
So finding your purpose and living in alignment with it.
Exactly.
What about relationships?
Relationships are essential for happiness. We've already talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth emphasizing, again, spending quality time with loved ones, nurturing those connections is crucial.
And expressing appreciation for those people.
Absolutely.
What about physical health?
Well, taking care of your physical health is also incredibly important. Our minds and bodies are interconnected, so things like regular exercise, a healthy diet, and enough sleep all contribute to our overall well-being.
So it's not just about feeling good mentally, it's also about feeling good physically.
Exactly.
And I imagine mindfulness and meditation can also play a role.
Yes. Mindfulness and meditation are fantastic practices for cultivating a sense of calm and presence. They help us manage stress, regulate our emotions, and even change the structure of our brains in positive ways.
And what about mindset?
Mindset is huge. Cultivating a growth mindset, believing in your ability to learn and grow, can make a big difference in how you approach challenges and setbacks.
So instead of seeing failures as the end of the world, you see them as opportunities for growth.
Exactly.
Now, are there any things that we should try to avoid if we want to be happier?
Yes, there are a few things to watch out for. One is excessive materialism.
Okay.
Always striving for more possessions or comparing yourself to others can lead to dissatisfaction and a sense of never having enough.
So it's about focusing on what truly matters to you rather than getting caught up in the consumerist culture.
Exactly. And speaking of comparison, social comparison, especially on social media, can be a real happiness killer.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the highlight reel and feel like everyone else's life is perfect.
Right. And that can make us feel inadequate or envious.
So maybe taking a break from social media or being more mindful about who you follow could be helpful.
Absolutely.
Any other things to avoid?
Well, spending too much time indoors can also have a negative impact on our mood.
Really?
Yeah. Research has shown that spending time in nature can reduce stress, improve mood, and boost creativity.
So get out there and enjoy the fresh air and sunshine.
Exactly.
And what about acts of kindness?
Oh, acts of kindness are amazing for our happiness. Doing something nice for someone else. Even something small can have a ripple effect, not just on the recipient, but also on ourselves.
So it's like a win-win.
Exactly. And finally, I would say setting and achieving goals can also contribute to our happiness.
So having something to strive for, something to look forward to.
Exactly. It gives us a sense of direction and accomplishment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's clear that happiness is not some magical destination that we reach.
No, it's definitely not a one-time event.
It's an ongoing journey.
It is, and it's influenced by a complex interplay of factors, our biology, our psychology, our choices.
Mm-hmm. And while we might not have control over everything, there are so many things we can do to cultivate more happiness in our lives.
Absolutely, and that's what's so empowering.
So Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has been a really enlightened conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And for all of you listening out there, I hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives and practical tips for creating a more joyful and fulfilling life. And if you enjoyed this exploration into the science of happiness, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel for more fascinating deep dives.
See you next time. All right, so welcome everyone to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're tackling something that I think a lot of people have been thinking about a lot recently, which is traditional education becoming obsolete?
Becoming obsolete.
And we've gotten a lot of really interesting stuff from you all.
Yeah.
And really our mission here is to kind of like go through it all, pull out the key takeaways, and kind of understand the different perspectives that people have on this.
Yeah.
And really try to understand what it all means for how we learn the modern world.
Absolutely. I mean, the sources you've sent in, I think, really highlight, a system that's really under pressure right now.
Yeah.
From rapid technological advancements to, evolving societal needs, and a growing chorus of, dissatisfaction, I think, with how things are.
Yeah.
So it's a question that has real implications for all of us,
Absolutely. And so when we talk about traditional education in this context, we're talking about that model that we're all pretty familiar with. Brick and mortar classroom, standardized curriculum that's designed to be taught to everyone.
Yeah.
And delivered by a teacher, leading instruction from the front.
Yeah.
This is a system that's been, the bedrock of education for generations. But it finds itself kind of at a crossroads, I think.
Yeah.
In our digital age.
In the digital age.
And I think that there's this real tension between this established structure and the very different demands of today's world.
Exactly.
So to understand where we are, I think we have to go back to the beginning and kind of figure out, where did this all come from?
Right.
Where did this traditional approach to education originate?
Well, I think what's fascinating to think about is that the foundations of traditional education as we know it were really laid during the Industrial Revolution, right? You had this massive need to prepare large numbers of people for factory work and also to participate in civic life.
Right.
So, the aims were very practical, right? To instill discipline, ensure kind of a baseline level of literacy and numeracy across the population, and to socialize children into shared cultural norms. So you have a system that was designed for, mass production and basic skills that now faces a world that really demands personalized learning and, complex problem solving.
Right.
So it's a fundamental shift in what is needed.
Right. It's about creating a functional workforce and a unified citizenry.
Exactly.
For this new industrial era.
Yeah.
And, you can almost visualize it, like the hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
The teachers are the source of knowledge. The students absorb that knowledge.
Yeah.
And then they're tested on it to make sure that they retained it.
Tested on it.
It's almost like it mirrors the factory line in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like a microcosm of order, The classroom with its fixed schedules, the ringing bells, the standardized textbooks. And then, of course, higher education stepped in to provide more specialized training for various professions.
Right.
Cementing the idea that formal credentials were the primary pathway to success. And this system undeniably served its purpose for a long time, drove significant economic and societal progress throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
But then, then the internet happened.
Right.
Automation became much more widespread. The world suddenly became a much smaller place because we were so interconnected.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the skills that were required in the job market started to change pretty dramatically.
It's a shift.
And, as one of the articles points out, it's no longer enough to just memorize facts.
Yeah.
Because that information is often just a quick Google search away.
Right there.
And what employers are really looking for is that adaptability.
Yeah.
The creativity, the digital fluency. So the question becomes, does a system that was designed for a very different time still adequately prepare us
for the 21st century?
For the challenges of the 21st century?
That's the central question, right? And this is where the arguments against traditional education really start to gain traction.
Yeah.
And I think the main argument, is that the inherent rigidity of this system, this one-size-fits-all approach, is increasingly out of step with the needs of modern learners and the complexities of the modern world.
Exactly. And we all learn in different ways at our own pace. We all have different strengths.
Yeah.
And to think that everyone in a classroom should be learning the same thing at the same time, and progressing through the material at the same rate, it just seems to ignore all of that.
Yeah.
And your sources point out that this standardization can often leave some students bored, feeling unchallenged, and it can leave other students feeling completely lost and disengaged.
Yeah.
And like it's a recipe for disaffection from learning rather than a genuine love of learning.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly striking is the criticism leveled at the curriculum itself, right?
Yeah.
While a foundation in, core subjects is undeniably vital, there's a strong argument to be made that the overemphasis on rote memorization often comes at the expense of, developing those crucial skills. that you were talking about that employers are really looking for.
Right.
And your sources point to that 2022 World Economic Forum study, which found that 65% of children entering primary school today will end up working in jobs that don't even exist yet.
Wow.
Which is pretty remarkable to think about.
That's a huge number.
It's a huge number. And, these future roles will demand skills like coding, data analysis, emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
These are all areas where traditional education often falls short. So the thinking is, are we preparing students for a world that no longer exists, rather than equipping them for the one that they're actually going to be, living in?
Right. We're training kids for yesterday's challenges instead of giving them the tools to tackle tomorrow's.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, we had this issue of standardized testing.
Yeah.
Which are these, often very high stakes exams.
Yeah.
That, as the articles point out, only measure a very, very narrow slice of a student abilities.
Right. And it can lead to this sort of teaching to the test mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that Alfie Kohn, who's quoted in one of the articles, really rails against. He argues that this intense focus on testing can actually undermine the very essence of education. It turns learning from this genuine exploration, into a performance, just another hurdle to clear to obtain a grade.
Yeah.
And so, what we see is that students often graduate with very impressive credentials, but they lack those essential soft skills, the ability to collaborate effectively, to demonstrate resilience, or to think with an entrepreneurial mindset.
And these are the things that employers are really looking for now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then if we zoom out even further,
Yeah.
we have this question of the sheer investment of time and resources that traditional education demands.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about, 12 years of compulsory schooling.
At least.
Followed by potentially, another 4 years of college.
Yeah.
Or even more.
Or more.
And it really begs the question of whether all of that time is really being used in the most effective way.
And are we front-loading education too much?
Right.
Into these first 2 decades of life when really we should be thinking about lifelong learning.
Yeah, and it's a significant commitment of time and, let's be honest, a significant commitment of money as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And the articles make a really compelling argument about the opportunity cost of all of that.
Yeah.
What else could students be doing with those years?
Exactly.
Pursuing their passions, gaining work experience.
Gaining real-world experience.
Engaging in hands-on projects.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things that could potentially be far more beneficial in the long run.
Yeah.
And in this era of, lifelong learning, as you said, this model of front-loading education in the first, 18 to 22 years of life.
Yeah.
It just seems increasingly out of sync.
It just doesn't make sense anymore.
With the reality that, we need to be constantly updating our skills throughout our lives.
And this is where I think the impact of technology is undeniable. We've seen this emergence of online learning platforms that have democratized access to information and skill development in a way that we've never seen before.
Yeah.
Your sources mentioned platforms like Coursera, Khan Academy, YouTube, which are all offering incredibly high-quality educational content, often for free or at a very low cost, and accessible at the individual's own pace.
Yeah.
So it's really, the breadth and depth of resources that are now available outside the traditional classroom is really quite remarkable.
It's impossible to ignore the example, that they provide, which is, a teenager in 2025 could be, mastering Python programming through a free online tutorial, much faster than they might in a traditional high school computer science course.
Yeah, and they might even get a better education doing it that way.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And, with the rise of AI tools, sophisticated chatbots, adaptive learning software, the potential for truly personalized education experiences outside of the traditional classroom are becoming, a reality.
Absolutely.
And so, this forces us to ask, if knowledge is so readily accessible, if skills could be acquired in so many different ways, then what role does that traditional structure really play?
What is its unique role?
Yeah, what's the unique value proposition there?
And I think this has led to, the rise of a lot of alternative education models.
Yeah.
Which is exciting to see.
Absolutely. Your sources highlight homeschooling,
which
has seen a surge in popularity in recent years.
A huge surge.
The National Home Education Research Institute reported over 10% annual growth in the U.S. between 2020 and 2023.
Yeah, and this is driven by, a lot of different factors. Obviously, the pandemic played a role. It forced a lot of families to try homeschooling.
Right.
But I think also there's a growing sense of dissatisfaction with traditional public schools.
Yeah.
And, technology has made it easier than ever to create a structured learning environment at home with access to virtual classrooms and all these amazing online resources.
Yeah.
But then you have unschooling, which is even more radical departure from traditional norms.
Yeah. As the articles describe it, unschooling is essentially a rejection of any formal curriculum.
It's child-led learning.
Right.
It's based on the idea that, children are naturally curious and they will learn best when they're allowed to pursue their own interests.
Yeah. And it's deeply rooted in the philosophy of people like John Holt, who argued that this, intrinsic curiosity is the most powerful driver of deep learning.
And so while it might be a more niche approach, the idea of interest-driven education is certainly resonating with people.
Absolutely.
Particularly this generation that's grown up, with very personalized digital experiences.
Exactly. They're used to curating their own content.
Yeah.
They're used to having things, tailored to their interests.
Right.
So it makes sense that would spill over into education.
Yeah. And then, beyond these home-based alternatives, we've seen this explosion in online learning platforms.
Oh, yeah.
And these aren't just replicating traditional courses in a digital format.
Right. They're offering micro-credentials, specialized certifications, even full degree programs. And they're doing it in a way that's much more flexible and affordable and more relevant to specific career paths.
Right.
LinkedIn reported in 2024 that 57% of professionals had taken an online course specifically for career advancement.
Wow.
So this signals a real shift towards, just-in-time learning, acquiring the skills you need exactly when you need them.
Yeah.
Rather than, front-loading it all at the beginning of your life.
Right. And then, you also have the growing emphasis on vocational training programs and apprenticeships.
Right.
And the articles, point to countries like Germany and Switzerland,
where it's much more ingrained in the culture.
Yeah.
There's this long tradition of, hands-on practical training.
Yeah.
And what's key here is that these models often lead to jobs much more quickly and with significantly less debt.
Yeah.
Which is a stark contrast to, traditional four-year university degrees, which, as you mentioned, can be very expensive and don't always translate directly into jobs.
Right. And, and even in the U.S., we're seeing a rise in initiatives like Year Up and, coding boot camps like General Assembly that, condense this training into much shorter, more intensive periods.
Yeah.
Really catering to this idea that people want to gain skills quickly and get into the workforce.
It's also interesting to see how even within traditional education, there are experiments happening.
Yeah.
They mentioned things like project-based learning and the Montessori philosophy.
So these are real attempts to, introduce more student-centered and engaging approaches.
Yeah.
Project-based learning, for example, it replaces those passive lectures with, students actually tackling real-world problems.
Right.
Which, helps to foster collaboration and creativity. And the example of High Tech High in California really showcases the potential of this model to produce graduates who are ready, for these innovative fields.
Yeah.
So it really suggests that, the future of education isn't necessarily about obsolescence, but rather evolution.
Right. But let's not write traditional education's obituary just yet.
No.
Because the articles also make a compelling case for why it still holds a lot of value.
Absolutely.
And one of the key strengths that comes up over and over again is the provision of structure.
Yeah, that's a really important point. While flexibility is great, that predictability and those established routines of a traditional classroom can provide a really vital foundation for learners, particularly for younger students. The OECD in 2023, found that students in more structured environments actually tend to outperform their peers in self-paced settings when it comes to things like persistence and academic achievement.
Interesting. And then there's that undeniably important social aspect.
Yeah.
Schools are not just places where you learn academic subjects.
Right.
They're also places where, children learn how to interact with each other.
Yeah, they learn how to collaborate.
Yeah.
They learn how to develop empathy. They learn how to navigate conflict.
Right.
Which are all really, really important skills. And the American Psychological Association has done a lot of research on this. And they found that in-person interaction during those formative years is crucial for developing emotional intelligence.
Yeah. And then we can't overlook the issue of equity. The articles make the point that public education is designed to provide universal access to learning, regardless of a child's background.
Yeah, and that's a really important counter-argument to some of the criticisms that are leveled against traditional education. While there are disparities between wealthier and poorer school districts, the ideal of universal education is still a cornerstone of a just and equitable society.
Yeah.
And this is something that online learning struggles with because it inherently relies on access to technology and reliable internet.
Yeah.
Which is not something that everyone has.
Right. And UNESCO estimates that there are still millions of children worldwide who lack access to basic schooling.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
The articles also talk about how traditional education plays a role in providing a shared cultural framework. That standardized curriculum, teaching everyone the same history, the same literature.
Yeah.
It helps to foster a sense of collective identity within a society. Some people might criticize that as promoting conformity.
Yeah.
But there's also that argument that it provides a common ground.
A shared vocabulary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the higher education level, universities are still these hubs of research and innovation.
Absolutely.
They're pushing the boundaries of knowledge in ways that are harder to achieve through, self-directed learning.
Right.
Or even these short-term programs.
And they're also producing the vast majority of, PhDs who are the ones who are doing that research and driving innovation.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the credential.
The credentials.
Even with all this talk about alternative pathways and skills-based hiring, the articles point out that employers and institutions still really value those traditional degrees and diplomas.
Yeah. The National Association of Colleges and Employers found that in 2024, 78% of hiring managers still preferred candidates with traditional credentials.
Wow. So it really hasn't changed much.
No, not really.
So if traditional education isn't totally obsolete, and it still offers, some value.
It does.
But it also has its limitations.
It does.
Where does that leave us?
Well, I think the articles really point to this hybrid future, where we take the best of both worlds and we blend them together.
It seems like the articles are saying that traditional education isn't going away. It's transforming.
It's evolving.
Right.
Yeah.
So, imagine learning environments with AI tutors, that can provide truly personalized support.
Yeah.
Imagine those high-stakes standardized tests being replaced by portfolios that showcase, real-world projects.
Yeah.
And imagine learning not being confined to a specific period of life.
Yeah.
But, it's ongoing.
Lifelong learning.
Right, exactly.
And I think technology is going to play a central role in all of this. Virtual reality, for example, can create these immersive and engaging learning experiences. Blockchain can be used to validate skills that are acquired from a variety of sources.
Yeah.
So you're not just relying on, that one degree from that one institution.
Right.
And, even the physical school buildings themselves can become these community learning hubs. Offering programs for people of all ages. Yeah. From early childhood education to adult retraining, and cultural enrichment programs. So they really become these centers for lifelong learning.
Right.
And I think in this environment, the role of the teacher changes.
Yeah.
They become less of a, the sage on the stage and more of a guide, helping students navigate this really complex learning landscape.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing glimpses of this in, different parts of the world. Finland, for example, has been very successful at integrating technology into a flexible national curriculum while maintaining very high standards for teacher training and a strong commitment to equity.
And in the U.S., there's this growing movement towards competency-based education, where student progress is measured by the mastery of specific skills.
Yeah.
Rather than just how much time they spent in the classroom. Seat.
Right.
And even universities are adapting.
Yeah.
Arizona State University, for example, has partnered with online platforms to offer more affordable degree options.
Right.
But of course, this transition won't be without its challenges.
Right.
Funding will be a big one.
Well, absolutely.
There's going to be resistance to change from entrenched institutions.
People don't like change.
Right. Yeah. And then there's the issue of equity, making sure that all students have access to these new opportunities.
Yeah.
And that we're not leaving anyone behind.
Right. And then there's the question of, as learning becomes more personalized and fragmented, how do we maintain those shared values and that sense of social cohesion?
Yeah, these are really important questions. So to bring it all back around,
Yeah.
Is traditional education as we know it becoming obsolete?
Right.
I think the answer is not yet,
Not yet.
but it's at a turning point.
It is.
We've seen that it has its strengths.
It does.
It provides structure, it fosters socialization, it aims for universal access, but we've also seen that it has its limitations.
It does.
It can be rigid,
Yeah.
it can be irrelevant, it can be inefficient.
Absolutely.
And the rise of these alternative models shows that learning can happen outside the classroom.
Yeah.
And that it can often complement or even challenge traditional systems. So I think the real question isn't if traditional education will survive,
Yeah.
it's how it will adapt,
Exactly.
and how it will transform to meet the needs of 21st century learners.
And that process of adaptation is going to be really crucial in shaping the future of learning.
Yeah. And so this kind of leaves us with a final thought.
Yeah.
Considering all the things we've talked about, all the challenges and the opportunities,
Yeah.
how will this evolving landscape of education really shape not just how we learn, but who we become as individuals and as a society?
That's a really big question.
It is. It's something to think about.
Yeah.
As we all continue on our own learning journeys,
Absolutely.
and watch this future of education unfold.
It's going to be an interesting ride.
It is.
Okay, so you've sent in some really interesting material about mindfulness. And, we really want to dig into that for you today and see if we can sift through and find out, what are some of the most compelling and maybe even like life-changing reasons to start practicing mindfulness. So really going to kind of deconstruct this whole thing, what it is, where it comes from, and how we know that it can be genuinely transformative in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at its core, mindfulness is really quite simple.
Right.
But it's also incredibly powerful. Really, it's about training your attention to be fully present in the moment. Noticing what's happening right now, your thoughts, your feelings, what's going on in your environment, and just kind of observing it all without any judgment. And, the roots of this practice go way back, ancient Buddhist traditions.
Right.
But what's really exciting is that modern research is not only confirming those benefits, but it's actually quantifying them in really incredible ways.
Yeah, and I love how, this isn't just about kind of feeling zen. Your sources really suggest some surprising impacts. We're going to dive into how mindfulness can really get in there and, shift things from like dialing down stress and boosting your emotional well-being to sharpening your focus, improving your physical health, even strengthening your relationships and helping you sleep better. So get ready for some real moments as we extract the crucial insights.
Yeah, let's dive right in with something that I think really resonates with almost everyone.
Right.
And that's stress and anxiety. Your material makes a really strong argument for mindfulness being a real game changer in this area. There's even talk of it actually lowering cortisol levels.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How does simply being more present in the moment actually lead to like a real physical change, like lower cortisol? It almost sounds a little too good to be true.
It really comes down to the incredible connection between your mind and body. When you're constantly caught up in worry or feeling anxious, your body basically goes into this like high alert state, and that triggers the release of cortisol. Now, what mindfulness training does is it helps you become aware of those anxious thoughts as they pop up, but without getting completely carried away by them. It's almost like creating a little bit of space between you and your thoughts.
So instead of being, tossed around in the rapids, you're standing on solid ground, kind of observing the flow without getting pulled under.
Exactly. And your sources highlight a couple of key ways that this actually works. One is that mindfulness helps you regulate your emotions more effectively. When you're more aware of your emotional state, you're less likely to just react on impulse or get overwhelmed by anxiety.
Right.
And then the other piece of this is the power of breathing exercises, which are often like a cornerstone of mindfulness practice. These exercises actually directly tap into your parasympathetic nervous system. It's kind of like your body's natural chill-out button.
That makes total sense. Slowing down your breaths.
Yeah.
It's like physically telling your body to relax.
Exactly.
You know that study from Harvard Medical School, the one on mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, showing a significant reduction in anxiety symptoms? That's not just anecdotal. That's like gold standard research.
Absolutely. And it really emphasizes that this isn't just some, fluffing concept. There's really rigorous peer-reviewed science showing that it's effective in tackling both those everyday stresses that can really wear you down and then also more deep-seated persistent anxiety.
Now, let's move beyond just the daily grind of stress. Your sources also really delve into how mindfulness can affect our overall emotional well-being. It sounds like it can really help you build kind of an inner core of resilience.
Totally. If we think about the bigger picture of, navigating the ups and downs of life, mindfulness gives you a way to really change your relationship with your emotions instead of trying to model them up or push them away, which, let's be honest, often just backfires. You learn to just observe them with a sense of curiosity and acceptance. And this creates space for you to process them in a way that's healthier and more constructive.
So it's not about, being in this constant state of like blissed out happiness, but it's about being better equipped to handle the full range of emotions,
Right.
the good, the bad, the ugly.
Precisely. And your material really highlights how mindfulness can actually help reduce symptoms of depression. It helps you redirect your attention away from those negative thought patterns that can really drag you down into a spiral.
Right.
It also cultivates self-compassion and self-acceptance, which are so important for strong emotional health. It's about treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend.
Yeah, that really hits home. We can be so hard on ourselves sometimes.
Absolutely.
And that study in psychological science that you shared, linking regular mindfulness practice to greater emotional stability and fewer mood swings, that seems to suggest, a real rankering effect on our emotional landscape.
Yeah, it does. It seems to indicate that with consistent practice, you become less reactive to the emotional ups and downs of life and more grounded in this sense of inner equilibrium.
Now, something that I know I personally struggle with in this age of, constant notifications and pings is staying focused. And your sources point to mindfulness as a real secret weapon against this digital distraction.
Right.
So how exactly does it help us sharpen our concentration?
I think this brings up a really important point about how our brains are wired in this constantly connected world. Mindfulness really offers a way to kind of rewire your brain for better focus. Your sources talk about mindfulness strengthening the prefrontal cortex, which is like the control center of your brain.
Right.
It's responsible for attention, decision-making, impulse control.
So it's like doing mental reps for the part of your brain that helps you stay on task.
Yeah, in a way, by regularly practicing bringing your attention back to the present moment, whether you're focusing on your breath, your physical sensations, or whatever task you're doing. You're actually training your brain to be more attentive and less susceptible to those distracting stimuli. And your sources also talk about improvements in working memory, your ability to hold and manipulate information, and cognitive flexibility, which is your brain's ability to switch between tasks and adapt to different situations.
That is huge. Being able to juggle tasks effectively and keep information readily accessible in your mind, those are such valuable skills in the world today.
Absolutely.
And that study from the University of California, Santa Barbara, the one showing improved performance on cognitive tasks and increased focus in students who practice mindfulness, that's really compelling, in this context. It points to real-world benefits for things like learning and productivity.
It does. It clearly shows that mindfulness isn't just about achieving a state of inner peace. It actually has measurable effects on your cognitive abilities and your capacity to focus.
It's just amazing to see how these seemingly simple mental exercises can have such broad impacts. And speaking of wide-ranging effects, your material even mentions the physical health benefits of mindfulness. Some of these connections were pretty surprising to me.
What's really eye-opening is the incredibly intricate link between mental and physical well-being that's often overlooked.
Right.
And your sources actually suggest that mindfulness can play a role in strengthening your immune system.
How does that work? Is it just an indirect effect through reducing stress, or is there like a more direct physiological mechanism going on there?
Most likely it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Chronic stress is known to suppress the immune system. So by effectively reducing stress, mindfulness can have a positive impact in that way.
Right.
However, there's also some emerging research suggesting more direct effects, possibly through the regulation of the nervous and endocrine systems.
Okay.
And, another really intriguing physical benefit is the mention of reduced chronic pain.
The idea that mindfulness can actually change your perception of pain, that's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's not that the pain goes away, but your brain reacts to it differently.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about eliminating the physical sensation itself, but more about changing how your brain processes those pain signals,
Okay.
making them feel less intense and less overwhelming.
I see.
And then there are the studies that point to lower blood pressure and improved cardiovascular health, which are really significant. They suggest that mindfulness really has this holistic impact on your physical well-being.
And that study in psychosomatic medicine that linked mindfulness meditation to lower levels of inflammatory markers really seems to connect everything together, because inflammation is implicated in so many chronic diseases.
Absolutely. It really even scores that mindfulness isn't just some abstract mental exercise. It actually has real measurable physiological benefits that can impact your entire system.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about relationships. Your sources explore how mindfulness can improve how we connect with other people. It makes sense intuitively. Being fully present with someone feels like a fundamental part of good communication.
It really is. If we go back to our earlier conversation about the core principles of being present and non-judgmental, think about how powerfully those translate into your interactions with others. Mindfulness really enhances your active listening skills because you're more focused on what the other person is actually saying rather than being distracted by your own thoughts or, already planning your response.
Right, so less mental chatter going on in your head means more bandwidth to really pay attention to the person right in front of you.
Exactly. It also fosters greater empathy. By becoming more attuned to your own emotions, you develop a greater capacity to understand and share the feelings of others. And the reduction in reactive behaviors is so key in preventing unnecessary conflicts. When you're practicing mindfulness, you're less likely to get swept away by, anger or frustration in the heat of the moment.
That's something we could all use a little more of.
Right.
And that research that you included from the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy showing higher levels of relationship satisfaction for couples who practice mindfulness together, that really speaks volumes about its potential to strengthen our bonds with others.
It does. It strongly suggests that mindfulness can be a really valuable tool for building healthier, more fulfilling, and more resilient relationships across the board.
Another area where so many people struggle is getting a good night's sleep. Your sources actually suggest that mindfulness could be a path to more restful nights.
Yeah, and it's really insightful here is how many sleep problems are really linked to just having a busy, anxious, overactive mind. Mindfulness tackles this directly by helping to quiet those racing thoughts that can keep you up at night.
So it's like turning down the volume on that internal noise that keeps you awake.
Exactly. Your sources also mention that mindfulness can help regulate your nighttime cortisol levels, allowing them to naturally decline, which helps you relax and prepares your body for sleep. There's even evidence that it might boost melatonin production, the hormone that regulates your sleep-wake cycle.
That is great news for anyone who's ever tossed and turned at 3 a.m. And that study in JAMA Internal Medicine demonstrating improved sleep quality in adults with chronic insomnia who did mindfulness meditation really offers some hope.
It does. It suggests that mindfulness can be a safe, effective, and drug-free approach to managing those persistent sleep problems.
Beyond all these specific benefits that we've talked about, your sources also touch on the more personal aspects of growth and self-awareness that mindfulness can foster. How does simply being present in your life lead to a deeper understanding of yourself?
This is where the practice can get really transformative on a personal level. By just consistently observing your own thoughts and emotions as they arise without judging or analyzing them, you start to become much more aware of underlying patterns. Things like negative thought loops that you might not have even noticed before, habitual reactions to certain situations, even your deeper motivations and values. And this increased self-awareness is like the foundation of personal growth.
So it's like holding up a mirror to your inner world, but instead of criticizing what you see, you're just observing it with curiosity.
Yeah, in a way, but with a really non-judgmental approach. Your material suggests that this awareness can help you identify and then start to consciously replace negative or unhelpful thought patterns with more positive and constructive ones. It can also foster a stronger growth mindset, making you more resilient when things get tough and more open to learning and change. And it can even strengthen your self-discipline and decision-making because it allows you to act with more intention and less impulsivity.
It sounds like it gives you more control over your inner life and as a result, your actions in the world.
Absolutely.
Finally, your sources connect mindfulness to the development of gratitude and ultimately a greater sense of happiness. How does focusing on the present moment lead to more appreciation for what you have?
What's really beautiful here is how mindfulness kind of gently shifts your focus away from what might be lacking in your life and directs your attention toward what's actually present right now. By really noticing and appreciating the little things, the warmth of your coffee, the beauty of a sunny day, a kind word from a coworker, you naturally start to cultivate a deeper sense of gratitude.
It's about savoring the here and now instead of always longing for the next thing or dwelling on the past.
Exactly. And your sources really suggest that this attitude of gratitude that's nurtured by mindfulness directly contributes to more happiness and well-being. It encourages positive thinking, reduces the power of negative emotions by fostering acceptance, and ultimately boosts your overall satisfaction with life.
And that study in the Journal of Positive Psychology linking mindfulness and gratitude exercises to a significant increase in reported happiness really highlights that connection.
It does. It really shows the synergy between these two practices, both of which are rooted in paying attention to the present moment.
Well, diving into your sources has been truly eye-opening. It's so clear that mindfulness isn't just a fad. It's a practice with deep roots and a lot of scientific backing for a really impressive range of benefits. From managing stress and anxiety to improving your focus, boosting your physical health, strengthening your relationships, getting better sleep, fostering self-awareness, and cultivating gratitude and happiness.
It really is amazing.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing for you to take away from this is how accessible this practice truly is. You don't need any special equipment or expensive retreats or even a huge time commitment. Even just a few minutes a day of mindful attention can start to make a real difference in your life.
So as you think about all of this, consider one area of your life where you might be looking for a positive change. Maybe it's dealing with the pressures of work. Maybe it's sharpening your focus on important tasks or just finding more moments of peace and contentment. Think about how even just a few conscious breaths or a few moments of truly being present in the moment woven into your day and routine could lead to some profound and lasting changes. It's an invitation to explore what happens when you truly show up for your life moment by moment. Okay, so I think everyone listening to this has felt this at some point, right? Like you're learning English, you're putting in the work, and you're making progress. You can understand a lot, maybe even have like a pretty decent conversation.
Yeah.
But there's still this gap,
Right.
this feeling that those who speak English really fluently and naturally, they're just operating on a whole other level.
Absolutely. And it can be frustrating.
Like there's this invisible barrier you just can't seem to break through.
For sure. And so many learners hit that point where they feel like they're putting in the effort, but not quite reaching that level of, really effortless and natural communication.
Totally. And so that's exactly what we're diving into today. What is it that truly sets apart those fluent speakers? We've been digging into some really fascinating research on this, and it really is like getting an insider's look at what makes the difference.
Yeah, and I think what's really helpful about the sources we've looked at is that they move beyond just, the standard advice. They actually unpack the specific habits, the mindset, the way fluent speakers actually approach the language.
Right, exactly. It's not just about memorizing more words or, drilling grammar rules over and over.
Exactly.
It's about understanding how they engage with English on a much deeper level. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down those key strategies, those approaches that you can start using right away.
I love that. Let's jump in.
Okay, so the first thing that kept coming up in our research was this idea of thinking in English. And I know at first glance that might sound, well, kind of obvious, right? But there's actually a very specific way fluent speakers do this that has a huge impact.
Yeah.
It goes way beyond just like knowing the English translation of a word in your native language.
Yeah, it's about making a mental shift.
Yeah.
So instead of constantly translating in your head, you're actually processing thoughts and ideas directly in English.
Right, so it's like bypassing that whole translation step, which honestly can be super mentally exhausting.
Totally. And you know what? It actually affects how you speak too. When you're constantly translating, it often leads to this kind of stilted or unnatural way of speaking.
Yeah, you don't have that natural flow.
Right, exactly. So thinking directly in English helps with that. It makes your speech more fluid, more spontaneous.
Okay, so how do you actually start doing this? The sources we looked at had some really practical tips. One of the simplest ones, believe it or not, is just labeling the objects around you in English.
Okay.
So like instead of just seeing a table and thinking mesa in your head, you actively think table.
I see.
And it sounds simple, but doing this consistently begins to build those direct connections in your brain between the object and the English word without needing to go through that translation process.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like building a new pathway in your brain.
Exactly. And another tip was using English for those little everyday decisions. Yeah. Like when you're choosing what to eat or what to wear. Instead of thinking it through in your native language, you try to make those choices in English.
Got it. So like if I'm trying to decide between an apple and a banana, I'd actually say to myself, should I have an apple or a banana in English?
Right. It might feel a little silly at first, but it's training your brain to think in English in those everyday moments.
I like that.
And then building on that, there's the idea of having an internal monologue in English.
Oh.
So as you're going about your day, you're kind of narrating your actions, your thoughts, everything in English. Like, okay, now I'm going to make some coffee. I need to get the mug, grind the beans.
It's interesting.
You're basically just talking to yourself in English, which keeps the language active in your mind, even when you're not actively studying or practicing.
I can see how that would be super helpful.
Now, here's a tip that I found particularly interesting. The sources strongly advise against translating whenever possible. So if you come across a word you don't know, instead of immediately looking it up or thinking of the equivalent in your native language, they encourage you to try to figure it out from context or use other English words you already know to express the idea.
That's a good challenge.
It's tough, but it forces you to think and problem solve within the English language itself.
Yeah, it makes you more resourceful.
Exactly. And finally, there's this fun one. Having imaginary conversations in English.
Imaginary conversations.
Yeah, like when you're alone, just play out different scenarios in your head, practice how you might respond to certain questions or situations, that kind of thing.
That's actually a great idea.
Yeah.
You can practice without the pressure of a real conversation.
Right. And the more you do it, the more comfortable and natural you'll become at forming sentences and expressing yourself in English. So the big takeaway here is that thinking in English isn't about knowing tons of vocabulary from the get-go.
Right.
It's about rewiring your brain to actually process the language in a different way.
I like that. Changing your thinking to change your speaking.
Now, the second big secret that we uncovered is something that I think a lot of learners struggle with, and that's speaking every day.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Especially if you don't have like a readily available conversation partner. But the good news is you don't actually need one to get in some really effective speaking practice.
That's encouraging to hear.
The sources we looked at highlighted a bunch of solo techniques that you can do anywhere, anytime.
I'm all ears.
So one that really stood out to me was shadowing.
Shadowing, okay.
Have you ever tried that? It's basically listening to native English speakers and repeating what they say as they're saying it, trying to like mimic their pronunciation, their rhythm, everything.
Oh, okay. I have heard of that.
It's really cool because it kind of taps into those mirror neurons in your brain, helping you naturally adopt the sounds and patterns of native speech.
Interesting. So it's not just about understanding the words, but also about absorbing like the musicality of how they speak.
Exactly. Another technique, and this one can be a little intimidating at first, is recording yourself speaking.
Oh yeah, I've tried that before, and it can be a little cringeworthy listening back.
Totally. But it's honestly one of the best ways to pinpoint those areas where your pronunciation needs some work. You can really hear those sounds that you're struggling with, or maybe where your intonation is a little off.
Yeah, I guess you can't really hide from it when you're listening back to yourself.
Right. It's like having that objective feedback. And then, of course, there's the classic technique of reading aloud.
Oh yeah, I do that sometimes.
It's a great way to practice pronunciation and fluency in a more controlled environment. And you can read anything. Books, articles, even like scripts for plays or movies.
So it gets you comfortable with saying the words out loud.
Yeah.
Even if you're not necessarily having a conversation.
Exactly. Now, going back to speaking alone, another thing that was mentioned was just describing what you're doing as you do it in English.
Yeah.
So like if you're cooking dinner, you're literally saying, okay, now I'm chopping the vegetables. I'm adding the spices. And you can even take it a step further and tell yourself stories in English. It's like that internal monologue, but you're making it audible.
So you're really just getting comfortable with producing the sounds and forming sentences.
Exactly. And The beauty of all these techniques is that you can do them literally anywhere, anytime. So for anyone listening who's thinking, oh, I don't have anyone to practice with, well, now you've got a whole bunch of ways to start speaking more.
That's so helpful.
Now, the third secret we want to talk about is something that I think sometimes gets overlooked, but it's so crucial for sounding natural and fluent, and that's mastering pronunciation and intonation.
Right. It's not just about the words themselves, it's also about how you deliver them.
Absolutely. You could have perfect grammar and a massive vocabulary, but if your pronunciation or your intonation is off, it can make it really difficult for people to understand you.
Totally. It's like, when you hear someone speaking your language with a strong accent,
Yeah.
you might be able to get the gist of what they're saying, but it takes extra effort.
Right, and it might not sound as natural or fluent. So, what are some practical things we can do to improve this?
Well, one of the best things you can do is actively listen to native speakers and really pay attention to how they pronounce words.
Okay, so just really focus on the sounds.
But also pay attention to their intonation, the way their voice rises and falls throughout a sentence.
Ah, that makes sense. Because intonation can convey so much meaning and emotion.
Exactly. Now, the sources we looked at also mentioned something called phonetic transcriptions.
Phonetic transcriptions, okay.
Specifically, using the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. Now, I know that might sound a little scary, but it can actually be super helpful.
In what way?
Well, the IPA provides a unique symbol for every sound in English.
I see.
So it can be really useful for figuring out those tricky sounds that aren't always spelled the way they're pronounced.
Right, because English spelling can be notoriously unpredictable.
Exactly. And once you understand those symbols, you can use them to break down words and really focus on pronouncing each sound correctly. That makes a lot of sense.
And then who doesn't love a good tongue twister?
Oh, those are fun.
The sources actually recommend practicing them because they help you work on specific sounds and improve your articulation.
Yeah, they're great for getting your tongue and your mouth muscles used to making those English sounds.
Right. And speaking of practice, recording yourself speaking and then comparing it to a native speaker is another really helpful tip.
It's like having a side-by-side comparison.
Exactly. You can hear the differences in your pronunciation and then work on those specific areas.
Okay, that's a good one.
And finally, one more thing that's super important for sounding natural. Paying attention to stress and rhythm in English.
Okay, so how do we do that?
It's about understanding which words in a sentence should be emphasized and which words are kind of glossed over.
Right, because not all words are created equal in a sentence. Some are more important than others.
Exactly. And the way we emphasize certain words and de-emphasize others creates a particular rhythm in English speech.
So it's like the music of the language.
Yes. And once you start to internalize those patterns, your English will sound much more natural and fluent.
That's awesome. So much to think about with pronunciation.
All right, so let's move on to secret number 4, which is all about expanding your vocabulary, but doing it in a way that actually sticks.
Yeah, because just memorizing lists of words can be so tedious and honestly not very effective.
Totally. The sources we looked at really stressed the importance of learning vocabulary in context.
Okay, so what does that actually look like?
Well, one of the most important things is to immediately try to use new words that you learn, both in speaking and writing.
So don't just let them sit there in your vocabulary notebook.
Right. Put them into action right away. The more you use them, the more likely they are to become a part of your active vocabulary.
That makes sense.
Another tip is to focus on learning collocations.
Collocations?
Yeah, collocations are words that tend to go together naturally in English. For example, we say make a decision, not do a decision.
Ah, I get it. So it's about learning those word pairings that native speakers just instinctively know.
Exactly. And then, of course, reading and listening to a variety of English material is key.
Right. The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more vocabulary you'll naturally pick up.
And the sources also mentioned using flashcards, but not just any flashcards. They recommend using a technique called spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you heard of that?
Vaguely. Remind me how it works.
Basically, it's a system where you review flashcards at increasing intervals based on how well you know the word. So you're essentially reviewing words right before you're likely to forget them.
Ah, that's smart. So it's like strategically timing those reviews for maximum retention.
Exactly. And it's been shown to be super effective for long-term memory. So the key takeaway here is that building your vocabulary is not about cramming as many words as possible into your brain.
Got it.
It's about learning words in context, using them actively, and reviewing them in a smart way. All right, so let's talk about secret number 5, which is all about immersion.
Yes, creating that English-speaking environment around you as much as possible.
Because, you know what, the more you surround yourself with the language, the more you're going to absorb it, even passively.
Absolutely. And you can do this in so many ways. One of the simplest things is to just change the language settings on your phone and your computer to English.
Oh yeah, I've done that. It's a subtle change, but it makes a difference.
It does. You're constantly seeing those English words and phrases, and it just starts to become more natural.
And it can be kind of fun, too, rediscovering your own devices in a different language.
Totally. Then, of course, there's watching movies, TV shows, YouTube videos in English.
Always a good one.
And don't feel like you need to understand every single word. Just enjoy the content and let that language wash over you.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised how much you pick up just from context and repetition.
Absolutely. Following English-speaking people or organizations on social media is another good one.
Oh, that's a good idea. You get those little snippets of English throughout the day.
Right, and it's often in a more informal, conversational style, so you can pick up on slang and idioms that you might not find in a textbook.
I like that. And what about actually interacting with people online?
Yes. The sources suggested joining online communities like Reddit or forums where people are discussing topics that you're interested in.
Oh, that's a great way to practice reading and writing in a more natural setting.
Totally. And you might even feel brave enough to start participating in those discussions yourself.
That's a good goal to work towards. So I think the takeaway here is that immersing yourself in English doesn't have to be this big, overwhelming thing. You can be as simple as making those little changes in your daily routine.
Absolutely. Okay, so our sixth secret shifts the focus to listening.
Ah, listening. So important.
So crucial. And the sources we looked at made this really interesting point. Great speakers are almost always great listeners.
That makes sense. The more you understand, the better you can communicate.
Exactly. So how do we become better listeners? Well, one suggestion is to actively expose yourself to different English accents.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's easy to get comfortable with just one accent, but in the real world, you're going to encounter a wide variety.
Right. So getting used to different accents helps you become a more flexible and adaptable listener.
Totally. And another great way to improve your listening is to, well, listen to things that you actually enjoy.
Okay.
So podcasts, audiobooks, anything that piques your interest. If you're engaged with the content, you're going to learn and absorb so much more.
Because you're actually paying attention.
Right. Now, another technique that was mentioned is practicing active listening.
Active listening, what's that?
So it's not just passively listening to something, it's actually making a conscious effort to engage with what you're hearing. So you can try summarizing what you've heard in your own words or taking notes.
I see. So you're really processing the information.
Exactly. And it helps you to remember it better, too. The sources also mentioned using playback speed adjustments, especially when you're first starting out.
Okay, so like slowing things down a little bit.
Exactly. It can make it easier to catch those individual words and phrases, and then as you get more comfortable, you can gradually increase the speed.
Makes sense. And I guess that classic advice of watching videos with subtitles and then slowly weaning yourself off them is still a good one, right?
Definitely. It helps you train your ear to understand spoken English without relying on the written word. So yeah, the big takeaway here is to actively seek out opportunities to listen to English in all its different forms.
Yeah, make it a habit.
Now, our seventh secret tackles a big source of anxiety for a lot of English learners. Grammar. Grammar. The dreaded grammar.
But here's the thing. The sources we looked at pointed out that fluent speakers don't necessarily think about grammar rules when they're speaking.
Really?
It's more like they've internalized those rules through so much exposure and practice that it's become intuitive for them. So they're not like mentally diagramming sentences as they speak.
Right, and that's what we should be aiming for. So how do we get there? Well, the good news is you can actually learn grammar naturally.
Naturally?
Yeah, through consistent reading and listening. You start to absorb those correct grammatical structures just by being exposed to them over and over.
So it's like osmosis?
Exactly. And another important point, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is, but it's so important. The more you speak, the more mistakes you're going to make. But that's how you learn.
Yeah, mistakes are just opportunities to improve.
Exactly. And speaking of improving, learning some common sentence patterns can be really helpful.
Okay, like what?
For example, if I were you, I would.
Ah, right.
These patterns can help you structure your sentences more correctly and fluently.
So it's like having a template to work with.
Exactly. And then finally, practicing writing regularly, like keeping a journal, can also help improve your grammar.
Because you have more time to think about sentence structure when you're writing?
Right, it's like a slower, more deliberate form of practice.
I like that. So when it comes to grammar, it sounds like the key is to focus on communication rather than perfection.
Absolutely. Embrace those mistakes, keep practicing, and you'll get there.
Okay, so secret number 8 deals with something that's super common among English learners: confidence, or rather a lack thereof.
Yeah, the fear of making mistakes can be so paralyzing.
Totally. And it can really hold people back from speaking freely.
So how do we overcome this fear? Well, one suggestion is to adopt what's called a growth mindset.
The growth mindset, okay.
It basically means viewing mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
So it's about shifting your perspective on making mistakes.
Exactly. Instead of getting discouraged, you see each mistake as a chance to get better.
That's a much more positive way to look at it.
It is. And along those same lines, try not to overthink things too much when you're speaking. Don't get so caught up in trying to be perfect that you can't even get a sentence out.
Right. Just go for it.
Exactly. Fluency comes from practice, not from trying to be perfect all the time.
I think that's something I definitely need to work on.
Me too. Now, another thing that can really help build confidence is actively participating in conversations.
Okay, but what if you don't have anyone to practice with regularly?
Well, there are lots of ways to find conversation partners, like language exchange programs or online communities.
Right, and in those environments, everyone's kind of in the same boat, so it's less intimidating.
Exactly. And finally, don't underestimate the power of positive self-talk.
Oh yeah, those little pep talks can make a big difference.
They really can. Remind yourself of how far you've come and celebrate those small wins along the way.
Because learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint.
It is. So be patient with yourself, keep practicing, and your confidence will grow. All right, moving on to secret number 9, which is all about those tricky little things called phrasal verbs and idioms.
Ugh, those could be tough.
They can be, but they're so important for sounding natural and understanding how native speakers really use English. Right, and they're everywhere.
They are. So how do we tackle them? Well, one suggestion is to pay close attention to how native speakers use them in conversations.
Okay, so listen for them in real-life situations.
Exactly, and try to figure out their meaning from the context.
Because they often don't translate literally.
Nope. And once you think you've got a handle on a new phrasal verb or idiom, try using it yourself.
That's a good way to make sure you really understand it.
It is. And of course, you're going to encounter them when you're reading too. So when you see one that you don't know, make a note of it, look it up, and try to understand how it's being used in that particular sentence.
So it's all about observation and practice.
Pretty much. And the more you expose yourself to them, the less intimidating they'll become.
I hope so.
Okay, ready for our 10th and final secret.
Hit me with it.
This one might seem obvious, but it's honestly so crucial. Enjoy the learning process.
Oh yeah, if you're not having fun, it's going to be really hard to stay motivated. Absolutely. So how do we make it more enjoyable? Well, one suggestion is to learn through things that you're already passionate about.
Okay.
So if you love music, listen to English songs. If you're a movie buff, watch English movies.
So make it relevant to your interests.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get creative. The sources mentioned using games, playing roles, even acting out scenarios in English.
Those are fun ideas.
They are. And another good tip is to set achievable goals for yourself.
Okay.
So instead of saying, I want to be fluent in English, break it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
So something like, I'm going to have a 5-minute conversation in English this week, or I'm going to read 1 chapter of an English book.
Exactly. And then when you reach those goals, celebrate those wins.
Give yourself a pat on the back.
It makes the whole process so much more rewarding and motivating.
So ultimately, it's about finding what works for you and what keeps you engaged.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, what have we learned from all these secrets? Well, becoming fluent in English isn't about some magical formula or being born with a special talent.
Yeah.
It's about consistent effort, the right mindset, and a willingness to embrace the journey, mistakes and all.
And finding ways to make it fun.
Exactly. So here's a challenge for everyone listening. Pick just 1 or 2 of these secrets that resonated with you and make a conscious effort to use them this week. Pay attention to how they impact your learning. You might be surprised at the difference they make.
I'm going to try that too.
Awesome. Because at the end of the day, fluency isn't about knowing everything perfectly.
It's about using what you know confidently and effectively.
Exactly. So keep learning, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep enjoying the process.
Couldn't have said it better myself. You ever get that feeling that feeling of being completely alone, like really alone, even when you're surrounded by other people.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think we all experience that at some point, regardless of like our situation or anything. It's a pretty universal part of being human, I think.
Yeah. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into that whole thing, into loneliness. We've been looking at this really interesting, really in-depth article that lays out a bunch of different strategies for how to deal with it, how to actually find some peace, maybe even, I don't know, like grow from those times when you're feeling isolated.
Yeah, and what's so great about this article, it goes beyond just offering like these quick fixes or these Band-Aid solutions. It really dives deep into the psychology of loneliness and offers some practical ways to approach it.
Exactly. And that's kind of our goal for this deep dive, to go through all these ideas and insights and pull out the stuff that's really going to be valuable for you guys, for our listeners, so you can use it to not just, get through those tough times, but maybe even like find some unexpected strength or even some self-discovery in those moments.
Yeah, it's not just about like surviving loneliness, right? It's about figuring out how to maybe even thrive when we feel lonely, which sounds kind of crazy, but it's possible.
And one of the first things the article points out, which I think is really key, is that loneliness isn't just about, physically being alone.
Yeah.
Because you can be surrounded by tons of people and still feel that deep sense of isolation, that yearning for a real connection, that feeling that something's missing.
That's so true. Like you can have a jam-packed schedule, be constantly going to events, parties, whatever, and still feel totally empty inside.
Which is wild,
Yeah.
Right? Because in this day and age, we're more connected than ever with all the social media, our phones, everything.
Right.
But it feels like, in a way, it's actually harder to find that genuine connection.
Okay.
And loneliness is, like, everywhere.
It's almost like a paradox, right? We're constantly bombarded with images and updates from other people's lives, but those interactions can be so superficial, so fleeting. So yeah, we're connected in a way, but it's often not the deep, meaningful connection that we really crave as humans. It's like we're starving for real connection in a world of endless appetizers.
So the article really breaks down loneliness, dissects it. And one of the first things it does is make this distinction, this really important distinction between solitude and loneliness, which I think can be easy to mix up sometimes.
Yeah, totally. And it's super important to understand the difference, right? Because solitude's like choosing to spend time alone. That can actually be a really positive thing. It can be a chance to, reflect, to be creative, to just recharge. Loneliness, though, it's that feeling of being alone when you don't want to be. It's involuntary, and it comes with that deep longing for connection.
Right. Solitude is something you choose. Loneliness is something that's kind of thrust upon you. And then on top of that, the article goes even deeper. It starts talking about social loneliness and emotional loneliness. Can you break those down for us?
Okay, so social loneliness is basically, when you don't have that broad social network, like maybe you've moved somewhere new and you haven't had the chance to build a community yet, or maybe your circle of friends has shrunk for whatever reason. Emotional loneliness, on the other hand, it's more about those close, intimate relationships, like having a best friend or a partner, someone you can really confide in, someone who truly gets you on a deep level.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You could have like a ton of acquaintances, people you see regularly, but still feel that emotional loneliness. You don't have those few people you can really be yourself with, And the article also talks about all the different things that can cause loneliness, right? Like loss, moving, friendships ending, sometimes even just like no obvious reason at all.
And I think that's an important thing to remember for anyone listening who's struggling with loneliness, that there's no one cause. Everyone's experience is unique. And sometimes it can be hard to pinpoint exactly why you're feeling lonely, and that's okay.
And one thing I really appreciate about this article is that it talks about the stigma that surrounds loneliness. It's like admitting you're lonely is admitting some sort of weakness, which is so not true.
Yeah, like you said, it's definitely not a weakness, but that stigma, that shame, it can prevent people from, reaching out for help. And that can make the loneliness even worse.
Exactly. So we've been talking about what loneliness is, some of the things that can cause it, but let's get to the good stuff. Let's talk about what we can actually do about it. And the first thing the article brings up is self-compassion.
Self-compassion is huge, EE. Especially when you're feeling lonely. Because when you're in that headspace, it's so easy to start beating yourself up. You think like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. Why else would I be alone? And that kind of thinking just makes everything worse.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Like you just start spiraling.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that inner voice gets so loud and it's just telling you all these negative things about yourself.
Right. Exactly. But self-compassion is like this antidote to that. It's about being kind to yourself, offering yourself the same understanding and support that you would offer a friend who is struggling.
So instead of judging yourself for feeling lonely, you basically comfort yourself. It's almost like being your own best friend,
Yes. And it sounds simple, but it can be really powerful. Dr. Kristen Neff, who's like the expert on self-compassion, she talks about these 3 key components: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness.
Okay, break those down for us.
Self-kindness is basically, treating yourself with gentleness, understanding that you're going through a tough time. Common humanity is recognizing that, hey, loneliness is a normal human experience. You're not alone in this. Tons of people feel this way. And mindfulness is about just acknowledging your feelings without judgment, just letting them be there.
So you're not trying to push away the feeling of loneliness. You're just trying to change how you relate to it.
Yeah, exactly. You're not resisting it. You're not judging it. You're just being present with it.
And the article gives some practical tips for how to actually do this, like, for example, challenging negative self-talk.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. So, instead of thinking, I'm so pathetic for being alone, you might say something like, okay, I'm feeling lonely right now. That's understandable. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person or unlovable or anything like that.
And it also mentions writing a letter to yourself, like an actual letter, but a really supportive, compassionate one. Have you ever tried that?
I have, and it can be kind of weird at first, but it really does work because it forces you to externalize those feelings, and then you can offer yourself comfort in a way that you might not have been able to do just thinking about it in your head.
I like that. Putting it down on paper makes it feel less overwhelming somehow. Okay, so we're being kinder to ourselves. What's the next step?
So once you started cultivating that self-compassion, the next thing to focus on is how you view solitude. Because when you're feeling lonely, it's natural to see any time you spend alone as this negative thing.
Oh yeah, totally. It feels like evidence that you're unwanted, right? Oh, no one wants to hang out with me, so here I am again, all alone.
Exactly. But the article suggests reframing solitude, seeing it as a chance for, self-discovery, as an opportunity to do things you enjoy without distractions. The article uses this really great metaphor. It calls solitude fertile ground, like a blank canvas.
I love that, like a blank canvas where you can create anything you want.
Right. So instead of dreading being alone, you can start to see it as this gift of uninterrupted time. Time to explore those hobbies you've been putting off, to read those books that have been piling up, or to just, relax and recharge.
And it doesn't have to be anything super elaborate.
Yeah.
The article talks about starting small, maybe just having a cup of tea and reading a few pages of a book.
Yeah, and the key is to make it a regular thing. Maybe you set aside 40 minutes every evening for some solo time. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. And eventually you might even start to look forward to it.
Okay, so we're being kinder to ourselves. We're reframing how we view solitude. What else can we do?
Another really important strategy the article talks about is cultivating a rich inner world. Because the thing is, when you're feeling lonely, your mind can become this empty, echoing space. And that just amplifies the loneliness.
Yeah, and then you're just stuck with your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And if those thoughts are mainly negative, it can turn into this downward spiral.
Exactly. So what the article suggests is actively filling that inner space with things that bring you joy. Things that make you feel connected to something bigger than yourself, like books, music, movies, art, anything that stimulates your mind and your imagination.
The article actually mentions a couple of specific books, like The Night Circus for its, beautiful language and that feeling of escaping into another world, and then To Kill a Mockingbird for its powerful lessons about empathy.
And I love that they highlight those specific books because it's not just about distracting yourself. It's about actively engaging with stories, with ideas, with experiences that can help you see the world in new ways, that can help you feel less alone.
And then there's journaling. The article talks about that quite a bit.
Yeah, journaling can be a great way to process your emotions, to get those feelings out of your head and onto the page. And they suggest using prompts to get started. Maybe you ask yourself, what am I missing most right now? Or what would I tell my younger self who might be feeling this way?
So you're basically having a conversation with yourself, but in a way that allows you to be more compassionate, more understanding.
Exactly. And the article talks about how that inner world, the world of your thoughts and feelings, can become a sanctuary, a place where you can find comfort and solace, even when the outside world feels overwhelming.
Okay, so we're building this rich inner world, this sanctuary for ourselves. But eventually, we have to engage with the outside world again, right? And that can be scary when you're feeling lonely.
Yeah, it can be super intimidating. Because when you're in that lonely headspace, the thought of reaching out to people, of putting yourself out there, can just feel like impossible. You feel like you're going to be rejected or that you're bothering people.
Oh, totally. And the article acknowledges that. It talks about how loneliness can lead to this inertia, like you just want to stay in your little bubble and not risk getting hurt.
But here's the thing, and this is what the article emphasizes. Connection doesn't just happen magically. You have to be proactive about it. You have to be willing to put yourself out there, even when it's uncomfortable.
And they suggest starting with small steps, like maybe just sending a text message to an old friend.
Yeah.
Just a quick, hey, thinking of you kind of thing.
Exactly. Or maybe you call a family member you haven't spoken to in a while. It doesn't have to be some big, elaborate thing, just a small gesture to let someone know you're thinking about them. And often, that's all it takes to open the door to a deeper conversation, to rekindle that connection.
And then, for building those deeper connections, the article talks about vulnerability, about being willing to share your feelings with people you trust, even if it feels a little scary.
Yeah, vulnerability is key to forming those strong, meaningful bonds. Because when you let your guard down and allow yourself to be seen, it gives other people permission to do the same. And that's how real intimacy is created.
So it's like, by being vulnerable, you're actually creating the space for others to be vulnerable with you. And that leads to real connection.
Exactly. And then, beyond reconnecting with people you already know, the article also suggests exploring new social avenues, like joining a book club, taking a class, volunteering.
I love that idea. It's like finding ways to meet people who share your interests, so the connection feels more organic, less forced.
Right, because you're already starting with something in common, and then as you get to know each other through that shared activity, those initial connections can grow into friendships.
Okay, so we're being kind to ourselves, we're reframing solitude, we're building a rich inner world, we're reaching out to others. And now the article gets into something that might seem a little basic, but it's actually super important. Establishing a routine.
Yeah, routine is like this anchor, especially when you're feeling lonely, because it can be so easy to just let your days kind of drift by aimlessly. And that lack of structure can actually make the loneliness feel even worse.
It's like you're just floating through time and there's no sense of purpose or direction.
Exactly. So the article suggests starting with the basics, like making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating healthy meals at regular times, and getting some exercise. These might seem small, but they make a huge difference in terms of how you feel both physically and emotionally.
It's like you're taking care of yourself, which sends a message to your brain that you're worthy of care.
Right. And then on top of that, you can start layering in other activities that you enjoy, like maybe you have a morning routine where you make yourself a nice cup of coffee and listen to your favorite podcast, or maybe you do some yoga in the evening.
It's about creating a structure for your day, giving it some rhythm.
Exactly. And even if those activities are things you do by yourself, the routine itself can be really grounding and help you feel less lost and adrift.
Okay, so we've got self-care, we've got routine. What about spending time in nature? The article talks about that quite a bit.
Oh yeah, nature is amazing for combating loneliness. I mean, have you ever noticed how even just taking a short walk in the park can totally shift your mood?
For sure, it's like all the stress just melts away and you feel more connected to, everything.
Exactly. The article talks about how those sensory experiences, the sound of birds singing, the feeling of the sun on your skin, the smell of fresh air, all those things can be so grounding and remind us that we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
It's like it pulls you out of your head and back into the present moment,
Yeah, totally. And it doesn't have to be a big production. It could be as simple as sitting on a park bench for a few minutes, or even just having a plant on your desk that you tend to. The point is to make a conscious effort to engage with the natural world however you can.
And the article suggests even bringing a notebook with you when you go out into nature and writing down your observations. I like that idea.
Yeah, me too. It makes it more mindful, You're actively noticing the beauty around you.
Okay, so we're connecting with nature, we're building routines, we're being kind to ourselves. What else can we do to shift out of that lonely feeling?
One really powerful tool is gratitude. Because when you're feeling lonely, it's so easy to get fixated on what's missing in your life. right? Like you're hyper-focused on the lack of connection, the lack of love, the lack of whatever it is you're yearning for.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. You just get stuck in that loop of, I don't have this, I don't have that.
Exactly. But gratitude is like a spotlight that you can shine on all the good things that are present in your life. And it doesn't have to be huge things. It could be as simple as, having a roof over your head, or a warm bed to sleep in, or a good cup of coffee in the morning.
And the article recommends actually making a list every day of things you're grateful for.
Yeah, and the key is to make it a regular practice. Even just writing down 3 things each day can make a huge difference. Because what you're doing is you're retraining your brain to focus on the positive, to see the good that's already there.
So it's not about denying the loneliness. It's about counteracting it with this sense of appreciation for what you do have.
Exactly. It's about creating a more balanced perspective.
And speaking of balance, we can't talk about loneliness without talking about technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, it's this amazing tool for connecting with people, but on the other hand, it can actually make loneliness worse.
Oh, absolutely. Especially social media.
Yeah.
Because you're constantly being bombarded with these curated versions of people's lives. And it's so easy to start comparing yourself, feeling like you're not good enough, not successful enough, not happy enough. And that can lead to this feeling of isolation, of being disconnected from the real world.
Yeah, it's like you're constantly reminded of what you're supposedly lacking.
Right. So the article suggests being more mindful of your technology use, like setting limits on your screen time, unfollowing accounts that make you feel bad, prioritizing real-life interactions over online ones whenever possible.
It's about making sure technology is working for you, not against you.
Exactly. And you can also use technology in positive ways, like joining online communities based on your interests. But even then, it's important to remember that those online connections should ideally complement, not replace, your real-life relationships.
Okay, so we're being mindful of our tech use. What happens when those feelings of loneliness just become too much to handle?
Well, the article makes a really important point, which is that it's okay to ask for help. If you're feeling overwhelmed, if the loneliness is persistent and starting to affect your everyday life, reaching out to a therapist or joining a support group is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Exactly. It's like if you had a physical health problem that you couldn't solve on your own, you would go to a doctor. So why not do the same for your mental health?
Right. And there are so many resources available now, like online therapy platforms, support groups, even just hotlines you can call to talk to someone. You don't have to go through this alone.
And another really interesting tip the article mentions is channeling your feelings into something creative, like painting, writing, music, anything that allows you to express yourself.
Yeah, I love that one, because it's like you're taking that loneliness, all that raw emotion, and transforming it into something beautiful, something meaningful.
It's almost like you're taking back control,
Mm.
Instead of letting the loneliness consume you, you're using it as fuel for something positive.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not about creating a masterpiece. It's about the process itself, about letting those feelings flow through you and out into the world in a healthy way.
And then another way to shift your focus outward is through volunteering, which the article also highlights.
Volunteering is amazing for combating loneliness. Because when you're focused on helping others, it takes you out of your own head, and it connects you to something bigger than yourself.
Plus, you meet other people who are also passionate about the same cause. So again, it's a natural way to form connections.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment. Even just an hour a week can make a big difference.
Now, the article also talks about something that's a little more unconventional, but can be really helpful for some people: getting a pet.
Oh yeah, pets are the best. They offer this unconditional love and companionship, and they force you to get out of your own head and focus on something else.
And even just the routine of taking care of a pet, like feeding them, walking them, playing with them, can be really grounding when you're feeling lost and adrift.
Totally. And the article suggests, if you're not able to adopt a pet, maybe consider fostering one, or even just volunteering at an animal shelter. Just being around animals can be therapeutic.
Yeah, it's hard to feel lonely when you have a furry friend cuddling up to you, right?
Right. And it can really make a big difference in your overall well-being.
Now, one other thing I thought was really interesting in the article is the idea of revisiting positive memories.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're in the thick of loneliness, it can be hard to remember that you've ever felt truly connected.
Yes, it can feel like you've always been alone, but that's not true, right? We all have those memories of times when we felt loved, supported, connected, and actively bringing those memories to mind can be really helpful.
So like looking at old photos, reading old letters, anything that evokes those positive feelings.
Exactly, because what you're doing is you're reminding yourself that connection is possible, that you are capable of experiencing it.
It's like proof that you're not doomed to be alone forever.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, the article talks about mindfulness.
Oh yeah, mindfulness. That seems to be the answer to everything these days.
Right. But for good reason. Because mindfulness can be so helpful for dealing with difficult emotions, including loneliness. It's basically about learning to be present in the moment, without judgment, and it can help quiet that negative self-talk that can be so loud when you're feeling isolated.
So instead of getting swept away by your thoughts and feelings, you're just observing them.
Right, and that can be really powerful because it gives you a little bit of distance from those thoughts. It allows you to see them as just thoughts, not necessarily truths.
And the article mentions that there are all sorts of resources available now for learning mindfulness, like apps and online courses.
Yeah, and even just starting with 5 minutes a day can make a difference. It's like anything else, the more you practice, the easier it gets, and the more benefit you'll get from it.
Okay, so we're practicing mindfulness, we're revisiting happy memories, we're being kind to ourselves, we're reaching out. But what about the future? Because loneliness can really make it feel like things will never get better.
Yeah, it can trap you in this feeling of hopelessness. That's why it's so important to actively cultivate hope for the future, even if it's just small things like planning a trip, signing up for a class, or starting a new project.
It's about having something to look forward to.
Exactly. It doesn't even have to be something that involves other people. It could be a personal goal, anything that gives you a sense of purpose and direction.
And one thing I really appreciate about this article is that it doesn't pretend there's some magic solution to loneliness,
Yeah, it acknowledges that everyone's experience is unique, and what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works for you and not being afraid to experiment, to try different things.
And the article also highlights that progress isn't always linear. There are going to be good days and bad days, and that's totally normal.
It's like a journey, right? With twists and turns and ups and downs.
And even on those tough days, it's important to celebrate the small victories, Like maybe you managed to reach out to one friend or you spent 10 minutes practicing mindfulness. Those small steps can make a big difference over time.
And the article ends with this really lovely anecdote about a woman named Clara. She found herself alone after a divorce, and she was feeling incredibly lonely. But she started incorporating all these different strategies we've been talking about: self-compassion, spending time in nature, joining a pottery class. And over time, those feelings of loneliness started to lift.
It's a great example of how, even in the face of really challenging circumstances, it is possible to find your way back to connection, to joy, to a sense of belonging.
So I guess the takeaway here is that as hard as it is, loneliness can actually be a really powerful teacher,
It can show us what truly matters in life, what we really value, and what we need to feel connected and fulfilled.
And it can make us more compassionate, both towards ourselves and towards others.
And it can help us appreciate those moments of connection even more, Those moments when we feel truly seen, truly heard, truly understood.
Because ultimately, we're all in this together, right?
Yeah.
We're all connected in ways we might not even realize.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that can make a huge difference when you're feeling alone. So for anyone listening who might be struggling with loneliness, know that you're not alone. And there is hope. And there are things you can do to feel better.
Yeah, and we hope that this deep dive has given you some ideas, some tools, some inspiration to start navigating those feelings in a healthier way.
So for our listeners, what's one thing you can do today, right now, to nurture that feeling of connection? Maybe it's reaching out to a friend, or taking a walk in nature, or simply taking a few deep breaths and offering yourself a moment of kindness. Whatever it is, take that step, because you deserve to feel connected. You deserve to feel loved, and you deserve to feel whole.
And sometimes taking that first step, however small it might seem, is all it takes to start moving in the right direction.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next time.